Tonight, we're diving into one of the gentlest what-ifs of all. A story built on a single act of quiet, stubborn love. The story of what might have happened if the boy who lived had been raised, not by an aunt and uncle who could not love him, but by the last man anyone would have chosen. Severus Snape. Imagine a cold night at Godric's Hollow, a ruined house, and a grieving man who makes a silent vow over the child of the only person he ever loved, and imagine that he keeps it and takes the boy home. Settle in now, let your shoulders soften, and let the room around you grow dim and warm. There is nothing here to solve, and nothing here to fear. Only a slow, steady telling meant to carry you toward rest. Over the next 20 chapters, we will move without haste through a strange upbringing in a narrow house full of books and potions, through a hard man learning, slowly, how to care for a child, and through all the old dangers faced by a boy who grew up guarded by a fierce and secret devotion. You do not need to remember any of it. Let the story move through you like a slow tide, and let it carry you, softly, down toward sleep. On the last night of October, in the small village of Godric's Hollow, the sky hung low and quiet, and a thin mist gathered along the lanes like breath that would not warm. The cottages sat close together, with their lamps glowing gold behind curtained windows, and somewhere a clock counted out the hours in a slow and patient voice. It was the sort of night that seemed made for stillness, for sleep, for the gentle turning of a season toward winter. Yet at the edge of the village, where a low garden wall gave way to a broken gate, one house did not glow the way the others did. One house stood, with its upper floor torn open to the cold, its roof folded inward, its rooms breathing out a silence deeper than any the village had ever known. The house had belonged to two people who were young and brave and very much in love, and now it belonged to grief alone. Inside, the air still carried the faint memory of a fire that had burned in the hearth only hours before, and the ordinary things of an ordinary family lay scattered where they had fallen. A book left open on a chair, a small woolen blanket trailing from a stair, a toy broomstick resting against the wall, its tiny twigs bent from a child's eager grip. Everything spoke of a life that had been lived here gently, and everything had gone terribly still. Down the quiet lane, footsteps came. They were slow at first, uncertain, and then faster, and then breaking almost into a run, for the man who walked there had seen the ruined roof from far off, and something in his chest had turned to ice. He was tall and thin, dressed in black that swallowed him into the dark, and his face was pale and sharp beneath hair the color of a raven's wing. His name was Severus Snape, and he had come to this village on a night that would carve itself into his soul forever. He did not know yet what he would find. He only knew that the woman he had loved since childhood lived behind that broken door, and that the sky above her home was wrong. He passed through the shattered gate and up the little path, and the garden that had been tended with such care in summer now lay gray and trampled under the mist. The front door stood ajar, hanging from a single hinge, and beyond it the hall was dark. He stepped inside, and the silence closed around him like water. He climbed the stairs with a dread that grew heavier upon each step, and when he reached the top and looked into the nursery, the whole of his world came apart in a single breath. Lily lay upon the floor where she had fallen, her red hair spread about her, her eyes closed, as though she had only lain down to rest. She had died standing between her child and the thing that hunted him, and even now, something of that fierce and gentle courage seemed to linger about her, softening the ruined room. Severus went to his knees beside her. He did not weep at once. For a long while he could not do anything at all except look, as a man looks at a truth too vast to hold, and the years fell away from him until he was a boy again in a green meadow, laughing beside a girl with kind eyes. All of it, every hope he had ever carried in secret, had ended here on this cold floor. He gathered her into his arms and held her, and only then did the grief break through him, silent and terrible, shaking his thin shoulders in the dark. He had loved her when they were children together in the north. He had loved her when the world had pulled them apart. He had loved her through every wrong turn of his own making, through every bitter word he wished unsaid, and he loved her still, now when it was far too late to tell her so. The night pressed close and cold, and the ruined house grieved with him, and for a time it seemed that nothing in all the world could ever move again. Then, into that vast silence, came a small and fragile sound. It was thin and uncertain, a hiccuping little cry that rose from somewhere across the room, and at first Severus could not understand it, for his heart had gone somewhere far away. But the sound came again, and this time it reached him, and he lifted his head. There, behind the fallen slats of a cradle, half hidden by shadow, a child was stirring. The boy could not have been much more than 1 year old. He had pulled himself upright against the bars, and his small hands gripped the wood, and his round face was streaked with tears, and with a single thin mark upon his brow, a curious shape like a stroke of lightning drawn in red. Severus went very slowly to the cradle, as though he feared that the child might vanish if he moved too quickly. He looked down, and the boy looked back up at him, and in that moment the whole of the grief-heavy night seemed to hold its breath, for the child had his mother's eyes. They were the same startling and lovely green, wide and wet and searching, and they fixed upon the pale stranger above them with the perfect trust that only the very young can give. The sight of those eyes struck Severus harder than any spell had ever struck him. It was as though a part of Lily, the truest part, had refused to leave the world, and lived on here in the small and trembling shape of her son. For a long moment he could not breathe. Everything he had ever felt for the mother rose up and turned itself, without his permission, toward the child. This was the boy he had reason to resent. This was the son of the man he had hated most in all his life. And yet the child had her eyes, and the child was crying, alone, in a house where the walls had fallen and the warmth had gone. Severus reached down with hands that shook, and he lifted the boy from the cradle, and the small body curled against his chest at once, seeking heat, seeking safety, seeking the nearest living thing. The crying softened. A tiny hand closed around a fold of black cloth and held on. Severus stood there in the ruined nursery with the child in his arms and the mother still upon the floor, and something happened in him that he could not have named and would never afterward confess. He made no sound. He raised no wand. But deep in the silence of his broken heart he spoke a vow, wordless and absolute, offered to Lily in the only language grief permits. He would keep this child safe. Whatever it cost him, whatever the years demanded, however little he understood of tenderness or of love shown openly, he would guard the last living piece of the only person who had ever truly seen him. It was a strange and desperate promise for such a man to make, and he knew even then that it would remake the whole of his life. Outside, the mist thinned, and far away the first sirens of the ordinary world began to wail toward the village. Severus wrapped the small woolen blanket about the child and drew the boy close, and the two of them stood together in the ruin, the tall, grieving man and the tiny orphaned son, bound now by a promise neither could yet understand. The night was far from over. There were arrangements to be feared and questions to be answered, and one old and powerful man, who would have to be faced before the sun rose. But for this single suspended moment, there was only the warmth of a child against a cold heart, and a vow held silently in the dark. Up next, in Chapter 2, A Bargain with Dumbledore, we'll follow Severus through the long hours after Godric's Hollow, into a quiet office where an old headmaster weighs blood and love and duty, and where an unlikely guardianship is set upon its trembling course. The hours that followed the ruin at Godric's Hollow passed for Severus Snape as though he moved through deep water. He carried the child away from the fallen house before the ordinary world could gather too thickly around it, and he wrapped the boy warm against the cold, and he did not let the small green eyes leave his own for long. There were people who would come for the child. There were plans already laid, made by wiser and older hands than his, plans that had been drawn in the belief that things would end differently than they had. But Severus knew, with the certain and heavy knowledge of grief, that before any of those plans could close over the boy like a lid, he had to speak to one man. And so, in the gray and trembling small hours, he made his way toward Hogwarts, and toward the tower where a single window still burned with a soft and steady light. The headmaster's office was a warm and cluttered room high above the sleeping castle, a place of curious silver instruments that hummed and turned upon their slender legs, of portraits that dozed in their frames, and of shelves crowded with the accumulated wonders of a very long life. At the center of it all, behind a great desk, sat Albus Dumbledore. He was old, older than almost anyone living knew, and his long silver beard and his half-moon spectacles and his robes of deep midnight blue gave him the look of a wizard out of an ancient tale. Yet his eyes, so often bright with quiet amusement, were tonight clouded with a sorrow of their own, for he too had loved the two young people who had died in the village below, and he too was counting the terrible cost of the night. When Severus entered, still holding the child, the old man rose slowly. He had known that grief would drive Severus here. He had known, perhaps, a great many things that he chose not to say aloud. The two of them stood for a long moment in the golden light of the office, the young man ravaged and pale, the old man weary and kind, and between them lay everything that could not be spoken. Then Dumbledore looked down at the boy in Severus's arms, at the small hand curled into the black cloth, at the thin red mark upon the little brow, at a great tenderness and a great trouble moved together across his ancient face. There had been a design for the child. Severus understood this even before it was explained to him. The mother's sacrifice had left behind a rare and powerful magic, an old protection woven of love and of blood, and that protection could be anchored and renewed if the boy were given to the care of his mother's only living kin. Far to the south, in a tidy and unremarkable street, there lived a sister of lilies, a woman of narrow habits who had no love for magic and less for the family it had claimed. To place the boy there would be to raise a wall of ancient safety around him, a wall that no dark power could easily breach, sealed by the shared blood of two sisters. It was a plan of cold and careful wisdom, and it asked the child to grow up unloved among people who would never understand him. And Dumbledore had believed, until this night, that it was the surest shelter the world could offer. Severus listened, and as he listened, something in him that had been hollow filled slowly with a quiet and immovable resolve. He did not argue in the way that angry men argue. He spoke of the vow he had made, though not in those words. And he spoke of the eyes the child had, and of the woman those eyes had belonged to, and of a life spent behind walls of cold safety with no warmth in it at all. He knew that street in the south. He knew the woman who lived there, for he had known her long ago as a sour and jealous girl, and he did not believe that any house of hers, however protected, could give the boy a single hour of true belonging. He asked, in his guarded and difficult way, for something that no one who knew him would ever have expected. He asked to keep the child himself. Dumbledore was silent for a long time. The silver instruments hummed. A portrait shifted in its sleep. The old man walked to his window and looked out over the dark grounds, over the black lake and the distant mountains, and he weighed in his patient mind the two futures that lay open before this small and sleeping boy. On the one hand, there was the blood protection, ancient and powerful and cold, a shelter of stone with no love in its walls. On the other hand, there was a broken and bitter man who had made a promise over the body of the woman he loved, a man of harsh temper and hidden depths, who understood potions and pain far better than he understood children, and who was offering, against all sense, to raise a child not his own. It was not a simple choosing, and Dumbledore did not make it lightly. He questioned Severus at length, gently and searchingly, testing the resolve behind the pale and grieving face. He asked what would happen when the boy grew willful, as all children do. He asked whether a heart so wounded could learn to soften without breaking. He asked, most carefully of all, whether Severus understood that to raise this child would be to bind his own life to a purpose greater and more dangerous than he yet knew. For the shadow that had fallen upon Godric's Hollow was not truly gone, and one day it might rise again to seek the boy anew. And to each question Severus answered in his low and steady voice, and though his words were few, the old man heard beneath them a devotion so fierce and so unlooked for that it moved him nearly to tears. At last Dumbledore turned from the window. He looked at the child, and he looked at the man, and he made a decision that would shape the whole of the years to come. He would set aside the plan of blood and stone. He would allow this strange and unlikely guardianship, but not without its own protections, and not without its own conditions. There would be enchantments laid quietly about wherever the boy would live, wards of the headmaster's own making, watchful and unseen. There would be an understanding between the two men that would never be written down and rarely be spoken, a bargain of trust and of shared burden. And there would be, above all, the promise that the boy would be raised in safety and in something like love, however severe the shape that love might wear. So it was agreed, in the quiet hours before dawn, in a warm high office above a sleeping castle. The old man laid his hand for a moment upon the child's small head, murmuring an enchantment too soft to hear, sealing the boy into a new and unforeseen fate. And Severus stood holding the sleeping child, bound now by a bargain as well as by a vow, and understood that his life, which he had thought ended in the ruins of the village, had instead been given a strange and heavy new beginning. He was to be a guardian. He, of all the world's unlikely men, was to raise the son of Lily. Dawn was graying the windows when he left the tower with the child asleep against his shoulder, and the castle below lay hushed and unknowing. The bargain was made. The path was set. What remained was to carry the boy home to a place that had never been a home to anyone, and to begin the long and difficult work of keeping a promise. Up next in Chapter 3, The House at Spinner's End, we'll come to the narrow, dim house of books and bottled potions in its gray mill town, and watch a man who has no idea how to love a child openly settle a baby into a spare and shadowed room. At the far northern edge of a gray and weary mill town, where the rows of brick houses stood shoulder to shoulder beneath a sky the color of ash, there ran a narrow cobbled street called Spinner's End. It was not a street that anyone chose gladly. The great chimney of the old mill loomed over it, cold now and long silent, and the river that had once turned the mill's wheels crept sluggish and dark beyond the houses. The lamps that lit the street at night were few and sickly, and the wind that came down off the moors carried soot and the memory of soot. At the very end of the row, where the houses gave out onto a scrubby patch of waste ground, stood the last house of all, and it was to this house that Severus Snape carried the child of Lily on the first gray morning of his guardianship. The house was tall and thin and dim, as though it had been squeezed narrow by the houses that had once pressed against it. From the outside, it looked no different from its neighbors, shabby and shuttered and unloved. But within, it was unlike any other house in that town, for every wall of the small front room was hidden behind books. They rose from the floor to the ceiling on every side, old books bound in cracked leather, their spines faded, their pages heavy with the learning of a lifetime. The room smelled of parchment and of dust, and, beneath that, of something sharper and stranger, a faint chemical tang that never quite left the air. For this was the house of a man who brewed, and in the low kitchen at the back, and on shelves in every corner, stood bottles and phials without number, filled with liquids of every color, some clear as water, some dark as ink, some that glowed very faintly in the shadows. Into this house of books and bottles and quiet came a baby, and the house did not know what to make of him. Severus stood in the front room with the child in his arms and looked about him at his own solitary world, and for perhaps the first time he saw how little of it was made for a living, growing thing. There was no soft place for a small body to fall. There were bottles within reach of curious hands that held draughts no child should ever touch. There was silence where there ought, he supposed, to be some manner of gentleness, and there was cold where there ought to be warmth. He had lived alone here for years, needing nothing and asking nothing of the house but shelter and quiet in which to think and to grieve. Now he must make it, somehow, into a place where a child could grow. Upstairs, at the end of a narrow landing, there was a spare room that had stood empty and shut for as long as Severus had owned the house. It was small, with a single window that looked out over the waste ground toward the cold mill chimney, and it had been used, when it had been used at all, to store the overflow of his endless books. On that first day, he carried the boxes out one by one, and he swept the floor, and he cleaned the window until the gray daylight could come through it, and slowly the little room began to look less like a forgotten corner and more like a place where someone was meant to sleep. He found a bed of the right small size and warm blankets, and he set them beneath the window, and he stood back and regarded his work with the frowning uncertainty of a man performing a task entirely outside his understanding. He did not know how to do any of it well, and he knew that he did not know. He had never held a child before the night at Godric's Hollow. He had never fed one, nor soothed one, nor sat awake through the long dark hours when a baby cries for no reason that any grown person can discover. In those first days and nights, he learned each of these things clumsily and alone, by trial and by weary failure, with no one to guide him, and no book upon his crowded shelves that could tell him what a frightened orphan child most needed. He learned that milk must be warmed, but not too hot. He learned the particular cry that meant hunger and the different cry that meant only loneliness. He learned to walk the narrow landing in the small hours with the boy against his shoulder, back and forth, until at last the small body grew heavy with sleep. He was not tender in the way that other people are tender. He did not coo, nor sing, nor speak the soft and foolish words that come so easily to those who love without shame. Such things were locked away in him behind years of hurt and habit, and he could not have brought them out even had he wished to. And yet, in his own stiff and silent fashion, he cared for the child with a thoroughness that never once faltered. He checked 100 times a night that the boy was breathing. He learned to hold the small hand in his own long fingers while the child drifted towards sleep. He moved every dangerous bottle to the highest shelves, out of reach, and warded the kitchen with quiet spells so that no curious infant could come to harm among the cauldrons. In the doing of these small and unadmitted things, a strange new rhythm settled over the house at Spinner's End, and the silence that had lived there so long began, very slowly, to change its shape. The boy, for his part, took to the narrow house with the boundless acceptance of the very young. He did not know that this dim place was strange, nor that the tall, pale man who carried him was an unlikely guardian, nor that a whole other future had been set aside so that he might grow up here. He knew only warmth when he was cold, and food when he was hungry, and a steady presence in the dark when he woke afraid. He learned the particular sound of Severus's footstep on the stair and grew quiet when he heard it coming. He learned the smell of the potions and the feel of the worn blankets and the pale square of the window above his little bed. And to him, in time, these things became the whole of the world, and the whole of the world became home. There were long gray afternoons when Severus would sit at his workbench in the back room, grinding roots or stirring some slow and simmering brew, and the child would lie in a basket at his feet, watching the steam rise and the light move, and the long, dark shape of the man bent over his work. The house was quiet then, but it was no longer empty. There were evenings when the wind howled down off the moors and rattled the thin windows, and the man would light the lamps and sit with the boy in the front room among the towering books. And though he read in silence and spoke not a word, the two of them were together, and the cold house held them both. It was not a happy home in the bright and ordinary way of happy homes, but it was a home, and it had not been one before. Winter came down hard upon the mill town, and snow fell soft over the waste ground, and capped the cold chimney in white. And behind the thin walls of the last house on Spinner's End, a fire burned in the grate, and a child slept warm beneath the window, while a solitary man kept his silent watch. The vow he had made in the ruins of Godric's Hollow was becoming, day by ordinary day, a life. It was a life he had never wanted and could not have imagined, and it was reshaping him more deeply than he yet knew. Up next in Chapter 4, A Reluctant Guardian, we'll walk through the first hard year of that reshaping, the resentment and the duty at war within one difficult man, and the small, unadmitted mercies that surprised him again and again with a tenderness he had never known he carried. The first full year of Severus Snape's guardianship was the hardest year of his life, and it was hard in ways he had not foreseen. He had expected the labor of it, the broken sleep, and the endless small tasks, and those things wearied him as he had known they would. What he had not expected was the war that raged silently within him through all the long months, a war between two things that could not be reconciled, and that fought for the whole of his heart while he went about the ordinary business of raising a child. On one side of that war stood resentment, old and deep and bitter, for the boy who lived now beneath his roof was not only the son of the woman he had loved, he was also the son of the man who had made Severus's own school years a misery, a man of easy laughter and casual cruelty who had taken from Severus the one friendship he had treasured above all else. There were days, especially in the beginning, when Severus would look at the child and see in the shape of the small face, in a gesture, in the untidy dark hair, a living echo of that old enemy, and something cold and hard would rise in him, and he would have to turn away and stand at the window until it passed. He had not chosen the boy's father. He had chosen only the boy's mother, and the boy carried both within him, tangled beyond any separating, and this was a grief that had no cure. On the other side of that war stood duty, and something that was slowly becoming more than duty. Severus was a man who kept his word with a fierce and unbending will, and he had given his word silently over a fallen woman in a ruined house, and he would sooner have died than break it. So each morning, whatever the night had cost him, whatever bitterness had risen in the dark, he rose and he cared for the child, and he did it well, because to do it poorly would have been to fail Lily, and that he could not do. Duty carried him through the hours when feeling failed him. Duty warmed the milk and swept the floor and walked the crying child along the narrow landing. And duty, held to faithfully enough and long enough, has a strange way of opening a door in the heart through which other things may quietly come. For the truth, which Severus resisted with all his considerable stubbornness, was that the child was working a slow change in him that no potion could have brewed and no spell could have cast. It happened in small moments, unlooked for and unadmitted, and each one caught him unprepared. There was the morning when the boy, not yet steady on his feet, crossed the front room for the first time on his own two legs and fell laughing into Severus's black robes. And Severus, before he could think, before he could arrange his face into its usual severity, felt his own mouth twitch towards something dangerously close to a smile. There was the night of a great storm, when thunder cracked over the mill town, and the child woke wailing in terror. And Severus gathered him up and held him through the worst of it, and felt the small heart hammering against his own chest, and understood that he would have stood between this child and any storm the world could send. He did not speak of these things. He did not even, in the privacy of his own thoughts, permit himself to name them fully. He told himself that he acted out of obligation, that he felt nothing but the weight of a promise, that the softness he sometimes caught stealing over his own hard features was weakness to be mastered and put away. But the mercies came anyway, small and unbidden, and he could not stop them. He found himself lingering by the child's bed at night longer than any duty required. He found himself saving the last of the warmth from the fire for the boy's room. He found himself, one gray afternoon, sitting at his workbench and reaching down without thought to steady the basket at his feet with the same care he gave his most delicate brewing. These were the mercies of a man who did not believe himself capable of mercy, and they accumulated, quietly, into something that looked from the outside very much like love. The house at Spinner's End changed with him, though its changes were as small and as unspoken as his own. The dangerous bottles stayed on their high shelves. A worn rug appeared on the cold floor of the front room, where a child might sit and play among the towering books. A second chair, low and small, took its place beside the great one by the hearth. The silence of the house, which had once been the silence of a man alone with his grief, became instead the companionable silence of two, and if a stranger had somehow entered that dim and narrow house, he would have seen a tall, severe man and a small, dark-haired child living together in a quiet that had, buried deep within it, a warmth that neither would ever have confessed aloud. Still, the resentment did not vanish all at once, for old wounds do not heal by simple wishing. There were bad days, and Severus, being the man he was, could be short and cold, even with a child too young to understand why. He was not gentle by nature, and he did not become gentle overnight, and there were hours when the boy met only sternness and severity where another child might have met open affection. Yet even on the hardest days, the child was safe and warm and fed, and never for a single moment left uncared for. And beneath the sternness there ran always that faithful, stubborn, unbreakable devotion. The boy learned, without knowing that he was learning it, to find the kindness that hid inside the hard man's silences, and to trust the steady presence behind the frowning face. By the time the year had turned full circle, and the snow had come again to cap the cold chimney in white, a great and quiet thing had been accomplished, though the man who accomplished it would never have owned to it. Severus Snape had become, in truth as well as in name, this child's guardian. The war within him had not ended exactly, but it had settled into a kind of uneasy peace, in which duty and something warmer walked side by side, and the resentment, though it lingered, no longer ruled him. He had been surprised, again and again through that long and difficult year, by a tenderness he had never known he possessed, and though it frightened him, and though he fought it, he had at last stopped trying to send the child away in his heart. The boy belonged here. Now, the boy was his to keep and to guard and, in whatever secret and difficult manner such a man could manage, to love. On the last evening of that first year, Severus sat by the fire in the front room with the child asleep against him, the small head heavy on his chest, one tiny hand once more curled into the black cloth as it had been on the very first night. Outside, the wind moved soft over the waste ground, and the snow fell silent past the window. Inside, the fire burned low and warm, and the towering books kept their patient watch, and a man who had thought his life over sat holding the future in his arms. He did not smile, he did not speak, but he sat there a long while after the fire had burned to embers, unwilling to move and wake the boy. And in the quiet of the dim old house, his hard heart was as full as it had ever been. Up next in Chapter 5, the eyes of Lily will watch the child grow and follow the daily wound and the daily comfort of a mother's green eyes living on in a small and beloved face, and the past that would not let go of the guarded man who raised him. There is a particular kind of morning that came often to the narrow house at Spinner's End, a gray and ordinary morning, when the light crept slow and thin through the gaps in the heavy curtains and settled without hurry on the small face of a sleeping child. Harry was 3 years old now, and then he was 4, and the seasons turned over the mill town the way they always had, slow and soot-stained and quiet, and in that quiet the boy grew. He grew the way all small children grow, in sudden startling inches, in new words that arrived from nowhere, in laughter that came loud and unguarded in a house that had known very little laughter for a very long time. And each morning, when Severus Snape came to wake him, or found him already awake and blinking up at the low gray ceiling, he was met by the one thing in all the world he could never quite prepare himself for. He was met by the eyes of Lily. They were her eyes exactly, that impossible green, the green of new leaves and riverweed and old glass held up to the sun, and they looked out of the small round face of her son with all of her steadiness and none of her sorrow. Snape had told himself in the earliest days that he would grow used to them, that time would sand the sharpness from the thing, that a man could accustom himself to anything if only he lived beside it long enough. He was wrong, and he came to understand slowly and completely that he was wrong. He did not grow used to them. He learned instead to live inside the daily ache of them, the way a man learns to live with an old wound that will not close, a wound that hurts most on cold mornings and hurts, strangely, most of all on the good days, on the bright ones, when the boy laughed and the eyes crinkled shut and then opened again, still green, still hers, still gone. For that was the truth of it, and it was a truth Snape carried alone and never once spoke aloud. The eyes were a wound and the eyes were a comfort, and the two things did not take turns, did not politely trade places, but lived together in the same green glance at the same moment, so that every look the child gave him was both a small grief and a small mercy folded into one. When Harry looked up from a spilled cup, or a scraped knee, or a book too heavy for his small hands, and fixed those eyes upon the tall, dark man who kept the house, Snape felt the past rise up in him like water in a well, cold and clear and rising. And he felt at the very same time a fierce and helpless tenderness that had nowhere to go and no name he would allow it. He could not tell the boy that his eyes belonged to a woman who had died to save him. He could not tell the boy anything of it, not yet, not for years. So he simply looked back and let the ache pass through him and turned to the day. The child, of course, knew nothing of any of this. To Harry, the tall man was simply the shape of the world, the fixed point around which the whole of the small dim house arranged itself. He did not know that his eyes reached back across a chasm of years and grief. He knew only that when he looked up, the man was there, steady and severe and reliable as the stones of the house itself. And that was enough, and it was everything. A young child does not measure love in warmth or in words. A young child measures it in presence, in the certainty that the same footsteps will cross the same floor at the same hour, that the same hands will set the same bowl upon the same worn table. And by that measure, though he could not have said so, Harry was a child who was loved. There were moments, and they came without warning, when the resemblance became almost more than Snape could bear. It was never the obvious moments, never a smile arranged for a picture, but the small, unwatched ones. It was the way the boy tilted his head to one side when he was thinking, exactly the tilt she had used, an inheritance carried down through blood and bone across a decade of loss. It was the way he laughed at things that were not quite jokes, at the private absurdities that only children and the kindest of adults can see. It was the way he grew still and solemn when something moved him, gathering his whole small self into a great and serious quiet. In those moments, Snape would find himself gone very still as well, arrested mid-motion, a bottle half lifted or a page half turned, staring at the ghost of a girl he had known when he himself was young and unmarked by the world. A girl who had once been his only friend before pride and cruelty and the slow machinery of a war had taken her from him forever. And yet he did not let the boy see any of it. This was the discipline he set himself, and he held to it with the same iron will he brought to every hard thing in his life. He would not let his grief become a weight the child had to carry. He would not let the boy grow up under the shadow of a mother he could not remember, watched every day for signs of a dead woman, measured against a memory he could never hope to satisfy. So, Snape hid it. He hid it behind the severity that came so easily to him, behind the long silences and the exacting standards and the dry, precise voice, and only in the smallest and rarest of gestures did any of the tenderness escape. A hand resting, for just a moment too long, on a small, dark head. A blanket drawn up with unusual care over a sleeping form. A candle left burning a little longer than strictly needful against the boy's fear of the dark. These were his confessions, wordless and deniable, and the green eyes never guessed at the whole meaning of them. As Harry moved from 4 toward 5, and from 5 toward 6, the eyes did their slow work upon the man, and something in Snape began, very quietly, to change. He had taken the child out of duty, out of a vow made over ruin, out of the last stubborn ember of a love the world had told him to give up. But a vow is a cold and narrow thing to build a life upon, and the eyes would not let him leave it cold. Every day they looked at him, green and patient and unknowing, and every day, against his own bitter expectation, the duty softened at its edges and warmed toward something the man could not yet allow himself to name. The past lived on in the child's face, yes, but so, it turned out, did the possibility of a future. A small and unlikely future in which a broken man might yet do one good and lasting thing with the ruin of his life. So the mornings came and went in the narrow house, gray and ordinary and quietly holy, and the tall man woke the child, or found him waking, and met the eyes of Lily, and bore the ache, and took the comfort, and turned toward the day. And the boy grew, and the eyes deepened, and the seasons turned over the mill town, slow and soot-stained and full, in their own hidden way of a great and unspoken care. Up next in Chapter 6, Lessons Before Letters, we'll follow Snape as he begins to teach the boy long before any school could, at the quiet warmth of the potions bench, where patience and control and care become the first and gentlest gifts a hard man knows how to give. Long before there was any talk of schools, long before an owl would ever come tapping at the window of the narrow house with a letter sealed in green wax, the boy at Spinner's End was already being taught. He did not know it as teaching, and that was precisely the art of it. To Harry, in those years between 5 and 8, the lessons felt like nothing more than the ordinary shape of his days, the way the house breathed and moved around him. And it was only much later, looking back with older eyes, that he understood how carefully and how patiently he had been formed, and by whom. The heart of the house was the room where Severus Snape brewed his potions. It was a low room at the back, crowded with shelves and stoppered bottles, hung about with the sharp green and mineral smells of crushed roots and simmering draughts, warmed always by the low blue glow of a fire kept steady beneath a cauldron. In a house that was elsewhere dim and cool and severe, this room was the one place that held a constant warmth. And the boy was drawn to it the way small creatures are drawn to warmth, without reason and without fail. And Snape, who might have shut him out, who might have declared the place too full of danger and delicate things for a child, did not shut him out. Instead, and almost without deciding to, he let the boy come and sit, first on a high stool set safely back from the flames. And then, as the years passed and the small hands grew steadier, at the bench itself, the first lesson, though it was never named as such, was the lesson of patience. Snape brewed the way he did everything, slowly and exactly, and he would not be hurried, and a child who wished to sit at his bench learned quickly that there was no hurrying to be had. A potion took the time it took. A root must steep until it was ready, and not one moment before. The fire must be watched and coaxed and never forced. Harry, who came to the bench with all the wild impatience natural to a small boy, found that impatience gently and firmly refused, again and again, until slowly it wore away, and something quieter grew in its place. He learned to wait. He learned that some good things could only be arrived at by waiting, and that the waiting itself was part of the thing, and this was a lesson that would serve him, in ways neither of them could have guessed, for the whole of his life. The second lesson was the lesson of control. Snape's hands were the steadiest the boy had ever seen, and Harry watched them for hours, the way they measured and poured and stirred. Never a drop wasted, never a motion made that was not needful. When at last the man allowed the boy to try, to grind a dried beetle to fine powder with a small pestle, or to count out the exact turns of a stirring rod, he did not praise and he did not soften. He corrected. Too fast, he would indicate with a look, and the boy would slow. Too rough, and the boy would gentle his hand. It might have been a cold way to teach, and to any watching stranger it would have looked cold indeed, but the boy did not experience it as coldness. He experienced it as attention, and to a child, undivided attention is a form of love almost indistinguishable from the thing itself. The man was watching him. The man cared whether he ground the beetle fine or coarse. In a world that had told Harry nothing yet of how alone another version of his life might have been, this steady, watchful correction was a warmth all its own. The third lesson, and the deepest, was the lesson of care. For a potion is nothing if not an exercise in care, in the tending of small things toward a right result, and in tending the cauldron the boy was learning, without ever being told, to tend. He learned that ingredients were not to be wasted, that a living thing gathered for a drought was owed a certain gravity, that the whole delicate art rested upon respect for the materials and respect for the process, and respect, though this word was never spoken, for the one who would drink what was made. Snape had spent his own boyhood in this same room, or one very like it, finding in the precise and honest work of brewing a refuge from a world that had offered him little tenderness. Now, without ever saying so, he was handing that same refuge to the son of the woman he had loved. And it was perhaps the truest gift he knew how to give, for it was the gift of the one place where he himself had ever felt safe. There were reading lessons too, of course, at the small table by the low window, for Snape would not have a child in his house who could not read, and he taught the letters with the same exacting patience he brought to the cauldron. He set books before the boy, old books with cracked spines and yellowed pages, and he did not choose them down to a child's level so much as he chose them to draw the child upward. Harry learned his letters, and then his words, and then whole sentences, and he read aloud in the gray light while the man listened, correcting a mispronunciation here, explaining a hard word there. And in this too there was that same quality of complete and severe attention that the boy had come to understand as the particular shape of belonging in that house. And yet for all the severity, the boy was never afraid at the bench, and this was the quiet marvel of it. He was afraid of other things, of the dark on the stairs, of the loud men who sometimes shouted in the street outside, of the vast unnamed griefs he sensed, sometimes moving behind the man's silences and could not understand. But at the bench, in the low blue glow, with the warm sharp smells all around him and the steady hands moving beside his own, he was not afraid of anything at all. The potions bench became, in the truest sense, the warmest place in a cold house. And it became warm, not because the man ever spoke a warm word, for he almost never did, but because it was the place where he chose, day after day, patient hour after patient hour, to give the boy the whole of his attention and the whole of his care. So the years of early childhood passed at Spinner's End, and the boy grew in the low warm room, and the lessons that were never called lessons took root in him deep and quiet. Patience, control, care, they were the tools of a potioneer, and they were far more than that. They were the beginnings of a self, laid down early and well by a man who could not say he loved, and so had found another language for it, the language of teaching, the oldest and most patient language there is. Harry did not know he was being given a foundation to stand upon for the rest of his days. He knew only that the bench was warm, and the hands beside his were sure, and that when he did a thing right, the man's dark eyes rested on him for a moment, with something that was almost approval. Up next in Chapter 7, A Childhood Under a Stern Roof, we'll see how the boy grew beneath that strict and guarded devotion, and how he slowly learned to read the kindness hidden inside a hard man's long silences and severe ways. To an outsider, and there were very few outsiders who ever crossed the threshold of the narrow house at Spinner's End, the childhood unfolding there might have seemed a bleak and joyless thing. The house was dim. The man who kept it was stern, exacting, and sparing with warmth to the point of seeming to have none at all. There were rules, and the rules were many, and they were kept. There was no cooing, no easy affection, No soft and doting nonsense of the kind that most small children are wrapped in like a second blanket. And yet the childhood that grew there, for all its severity, was neither bleak nor joyless, and the boy who lived it was, in the strange and hidden way of that house, a well-kept and well-loved child. It simply took a certain kind of looking to see it, and the boy, in time, learned exactly that kind of looking. The roof was stern, there was no denying it. Severus Snape ran his household the way he ran his classroom, which the boy would not see for years yet, and the way he ran the whole of his careful, guarded life, by precise standards firmly held. Meals came at set hours. Bedtime came at a set hour, and it was not negotiated. Chores were expected, and expected to be done properly, and a task done carelessly was sent back to be done again without heat and without exception. Untruths were not tolerated, not even the small, soft untruths that children reach for out of fear, and the boy learned early that whatever the truth was, it would go better with the man than any lie, however clumsy or well-meant. It was, in every visible particular, a strict upbringing, and Harry grew up knowing exactly where the edges of things were, which is itself a kind of safety that many more indulged children never know. For that was the secret buried inside the sternness. The rules were not cruelty. The rules were a wall built around the boy, and inside that wall he was safe, and some part of him understood this long before he could have put words to it. The world outside the narrow house was uncertain and often unkind, a gray mill town of shuttered factories and hard weather. And beyond it, though the boy knew nothing of this, a wider world still carrying the deep scars of a war and the shadow of dangers not yet ended. But inside the house, the day had a shape, and the shape held. The same hour brought the same meal. The same word brought the same response. The man was severe, but the man was never capricious, never cruel one day and kind the next, in the frightening way that some adults are. And in that steadiness, the boy found a ground firm enough to grow upon. Children do not need to be pampered to feel safe. They need to be able to predict the ones who care for them, and Snape, whatever else he was as predictable as stone. And so the boy learned to read him. This was, perhaps, the great work of Harry's childhood, and no one said it as a lesson, and it may have been the most important learning of all. He learned to read the hard man's silences, which were many and long and various, and to tell one kind of silence from another. There was the silence of concentration, when the man was deep in his work and not to be disturbed, and the boy learned to move quietly through the house in those hours and let him be. There was the silence of displeasure, colder and sharper, that meant a thing had been done wrong and would need to be set right. And there was another silence, rarer and harder to name, a heavy and faraway silence that would come over the man sometimes in the evenings, when he sat by the low fire with a book he was not reading, and his dark eyes fixed on nothing at all. In that silence, the boy learned not to press and not to pry, but simply to be near, and he found that his mere quiet presence in the room seemed, in some way he did not understand, to ease it. He was reading grief, though he did not know the word for what he read. He learned to read the severity too, and to find the kindness folded up inside it. When the man corrected his work at the potions bench, or sent a chore back to be done again, or held him to a standard that felt, to a small boy, impossibly high, Harry came to understand that this was not the man wishing him ill. It was the opposite. It was the man taking him seriously, holding him to the belief that he was capable of better, refusing to expect less of him than he could give. A child left to do sloppy work is a child no one particularly cares about. Harry was never once left to do sloppy work, and slowly, over the years, he came to feel the caring inside the correction. The way one feels warmth through a thick coat, muffled but unmistakably there. And there were the small mercies, the wordless ones, that the boy collected without quite knowing he was collecting them. There was the way a favorite meal would appear, unremarked, on a day the man had somehow sensed the boy was low. There was the fever, one hard winter, when Harry woke in the deep of the night to find the tall, dark shape seated beside his bed, silent and unmoving, keeping watch, and in the morning nothing was said of it at all, as though it had not happened, as though a man who could not speak of tenderness could still, in the dark and unwitnessed hours, sit vigil beside a sick child until the danger passed. There was the way the man's hand would come to rest, now and then, upon his shoulder, brief and heavy and gone before it could be remarked, a touch that in another household would have been a hug, and in this one was as much as the man could give, and every bit as full of meaning. Harry gathered these things up and held them, and they told him, more surely than any spoken word could have, that he was not alone and not unwanted, that behind the stern face and the long silences there was someone who would, without ever admitting it, have gone into fire for him. He was not a spoiled child, and he did not become a soft one. The stern roof made him watchful, careful, a little grave for his years, quick to notice the moods of others, and slow to trust the easy warmth of strangers. But it made him strong too, and steady, and kind in the deep, quiet way of children who have had to learn kindness by watching for its hidden signs rather than being showered in its open displays. He grew up knowing the difference between the loud affection that costs nothing and the silent care that costs everything, and he came to prize the second and to give it himself. And this was among the truest inheritances the narrow house ever passed to him. So the childhood went on, year after strict and safe and secretly devoted year, under the stern roof of Spinner's End. The boy grew, and the man grew, in his own guarded and unwilling way, to love him, and neither of them said so, because in that house love was not a thing that was said. It was a thing that was done, quietly and reliably and at cost, in 1,000 small, unspoken acts, and the boy, learning to read the man, learned in the end to read them all. Up next in Chapter 8, The Truth About His Mother, we'll listen as Snape, in his own halting and guarded way, through stories and long silences, begins to give the boy the mother he never knew, and keeps Lily alive in the memory of her son. Of all the hard things Severus Snape had taken upon himself when he carried the child home from the ruin at Godric's Hollow, there was one that he had not foreseen, and it proved in the end to be the hardest of them all. It was not the feeding, or the housing, or the teaching. It was not the long broken nights of the first year, nor the slow daily ache of the green eyes. It was this, that a boy grows, and a growing boy begins to ask, and sooner or later he asks about his mother. And Snape, who had loved that mother more deeply and more hopelessly than he had ever loved anything in his life, had to find some way to answer, and there was no answer that did not cut him to the bone. The questions came slowly at first, in the way of small children, sidelong and half-formed. Harry was perhaps 6 when he first understood, in the dim way of childhood, that other children seemed to have mothers, and that he did not, and that this was a thing that had happened rather than a thing that had simply always been. He did not ask outright, not for a long time. He circled the question the way small creatures circle something that frightens them, coming close and then darting away, and Snape, who missed nothing, saw it coming from a long way off and dreaded it and did not turn from it. For here was a thing he had decided somewhere in the earliest days and held to ever after. The boy would know his mother, Whatever else the world had taken from Harry, it would not take this. He would grow up knowing that he had been loved into being by a woman of great heart, and he would carry her with him, and Snape would see to it, though it cost him every hard hour of the telling. So when the questions finally came plainly, Snape did not deflect them, and he did not lie. But neither could he speak of Lily the way another man might have, easily and warmly in a flood of fond stories. That was not in him, and it was made harder still by the depth and the strangeness of what he had felt for her, a love bound up with guilt and grief, and an old wound of his own making. He could not simply talk. So he did the only thing he could. He gave the boy his mother in pieces, in fragments, in the guarded and roundabout way that was the only way he had. And the pieces, gathered over years, slowly made a whole. He gave her first through small facts, offered flatly and without adornment, as though they were merely items of information and not the dearest treasures he possessed. Her name had been Lily. Her eyes had been green, the very green the boy saw each morning in the mirror. She had been clever, cleverer than almost anyone, and quick with her wand, and quicker still with her kindness. She had grown up not far from the very mill town where the boy now lived, an ordinary girl from an ordinary street who had turned out to be extraordinary. These things Snape said in his dry, even voice, a little at a time, never many at once, and the boy gathered each one and kept it like a smooth stone in a pocket, turning it over and over in the private dark of his own thoughts. He gave her too, through longer silences, and these were in their way more eloquent than any story. There were evenings when some small thing the boy did, a tilt of the head, a particular laugh, a sudden serious stillness, would strike the man so hard that he would fall quiet and go very far away behind his eyes. And Harry, who had learned to read those silences, understood in time that these were the moments when his mother came nearest. He learned not to break them. He learned to sit in them, quiet and near, and he came to feel that in some strange fashion the two of them were remembering her together, the man who had known her and the boy who never could, sharing a grief across the gap of it. And this wordless sharing bound them closer than any conversation could have done. And now and then, rarely, on the deep still nights when the fire had burned low and the mill town lay hushed under its blanket of dark, Snape would tell a story. They were never long, and they were never soft, and he told them looking into the fire rather than at the boy, as though he could not manage the telling and the being seen to tell at the same time. He told of a girl who had once shown a lonely and unhappy boy a small kindness when no one else would. He told of a girl who could make a flower open and close in the palm of her hand for the sheer wonder of it. He told of a girl whose loyalty, once given, was given wholly and forever, and whose anger, when it came, was the honest anger of someone who cared too much to look away from a wrong. He never said, in those stories, who the lonely boy had been. He never had to. The boy listening in the firelight understood more than the man meant him to, and loved him, in a way, all the more for what he left unsaid. Piece by piece then, and year by year, Lily grew real in the mind of her son. She was not a photograph, and she was not a grave, and she was not an absence shaped like a wound, which is what she might so easily have become. She was a person, clever and warm and brave and kind, a person who had lived and laughed and loved fiercely, and who had, in the last terrible act of that love, given her own life so that her son might keep his. Snape gave the boy that final truth carefully and late, when he judged him old enough to bear it, and he gave it plainly, that his mother had died to save him, that she had stood between him and the ending and would not move, and that the boy was alive because she had chosen it with the whole of her heart. It was a heavy thing to lay upon a child, and Snape did not lay it lightly, but he laid it, because he believed the boy had a right to know what he had been worth to her, and what she had thought a boy like him was worth. And so a strange and quiet gift passed between them across the years, a gift the boy would not fully understand until he was grown. The man who could not speak of his own love had spent that love instead in keeping alive the memory of another's. Every guarded fact, every shared silence, every fireside story told to the flames rather than the boy, was Snape holding the door open against forgetting, refusing to let Lily fade into the gray of an unremembered past. He gave the boy a mother, whole and warm and real, out of the ruins of his own heart, and asked nothing in return, and never once let on how much each telling cost him. Harry grew up then, knowing his mother, which is to say, knowing her love, which is the only part of a lost parent that a child can truly keep. He carried her with him, green-eyed and clever and brave, a warmth at the center of him that the cold of the world could not reach. And though he did not yet grasp the fullness of what the stern dark man had done for him in the giving of her, some part of him always knew that the two things were bound together. His mother's love and the man's silent keeping of it, two devotions wound so tightly around his small life that he could not have said, and never needed to, where the one ended and the other began. Up next in Chapter 9, Occlumency at a Young Age, we'll watch as Snape begins to teach the boy a strange and difficult discipline, the guarding of his own mind, planting early and deep the very defense that will one day rise up to save his life. Chapter 9. Occlumency at a Young Age. There is a kind of quiet that lives inside a house of potions, and Harry had grown up inside it the way other children grow up inside the sound of a garden. At Spinner's End, the quiet was not empty. It was full of small things that only patience could hear. The tick of cooling glass, the slow settle of a floorboard as the fire burned low, the turning of a page in the next room, where a tall man sat with his book and did not always look up, and yet somehow always knew when the boy was near. It was into this quiet, when Harry was 9 years old, that Severus Snape first spoke to him about the mind. He did not call it a lesson at the beginning. He called it nothing at all. He simply set two chairs facing one another before the hearth one gray evening, and he waited until the boy sat down across from him. And then he told Harry that the mind was a room like any other, and that most people left the door of that room standing open all their lives without ever once thinking to close it. Harry did not understand this at first. He was a thoughtful child, watchful and slow to speak, and he had learned long ago that his guardian did not waste words on things that did not matter. So he sat, and he listened, and he tried to imagine the door that Snape was describing, a door inside himself, a door he had never seen and never touched, and yet a door that had always been there, hanging quietly on hinges he had never oiled. The discipline was called occlumency, Snape told him, and it was the art of closing that door. There was another art, its shadow and its opposite, called legilimency, which was the art of opening the doors of others and walking through them uninvited, reading what was written on the walls of a stranger's private thoughts. Snape spoke of legilimency the way a careful man speaks of fire, with respect and with a certain cold distance, and he told the boy that there were people in the world who could do this thing, and that some of them would one day wish very much to do it to him. Harry was too young to know why. He knew only that his guardian's face had changed as he said it, that the long, severe features had settled into something even stiller than usual, and that under the stillness there was something that Harry, who had spent his whole short life learning to read the silences of this difficult man, recognized at once as fear, not fear for himself. Snape did not seem to Harry to be a man who feared for himself. It was fear for the boy in the chair across from him, and Harry felt it settle over the room like the cool that comes before rain. So they began. In the beginning, it was very hard, and it was hard in a way that no lesson at the potions bench had ever been hard. The potions had asked Harry only to be patient and exact, to measure and to wait, and these were things he had learned young and learned well. But occlumency asked something stranger. It asked him to empty himself. It asked him to take the crowd of small feelings that lived inside any 9-year-old boy, the worries and the wishes and the sudden bright wants, and to set them all down, gently, the way one sets down a full basket, and to stand there afterward, holding nothing at all. Snape taught him to do this before sleep, which was the time the boy found easiest and hardest both. Easiest, because his body was already slowing, and the fire was already dim, and the whole house was folding itself toward night. Hardest, because sleep is exactly the hour when the mind grows loud, when the day comes back in pieces and floats up unbidden, when a child lies still in the dark and finds that his thoughts will not lie still with him. Snape told him to breathe slowly and to watch each thought arrive and to let each one go again without holding it. The way a person standing at a window watches leaves fall past the glass and does not reach out to catch a single one. It did not work at first. Of course it did not. Harry would empty his mind for the space of 3 breaths, and then some ordinary thought would drift up. A thought of the frost on the window or the smell of the evening soup, and he would follow it without meaning to, and by the time he noticed, the room inside him was full again, and the door was standing open once more. But Snape did not scold him for this. That was the thing Harry would remember longest, years afterward, when he was grown and understood at last how much this man had carried. Snape, who was sharp with nearly everyone, who wore his impatience like a dark coat, was never once sharp with Harry over this. When the boy failed, and he failed a great many times, the tall man only inclined his head and told him to begin again, and there was in the plainness of those words a patience that Harry had nowhere else in his life. Slowly, over that autumn and the long winter that followed it, the boy began to find the door. He learned the shape of it first, the way one learns the shape of a room in the dark by touch. He learned that a certain kind of stillness came before it, a settling, like water going smooth after the last ripple has crossed it. And then, one cold night in the deep of February, lying in the spare room that had been his since before he could remember, Harry closed the door of his mind for the first time and felt the quiet on the other side of it. A quiet that was his own, and that no one else could enter. He did not tell Snape at once. He was a private boy, and the moment felt too new to speak of. But the next evening, when they sat again before the fire, the tall man looked at him for a long while with those dark, unreadable eyes, and Harry understood that his guardian had seen it, had felt the closed door where before there had been an open one, and that Snape was, in his own guarded and silent fashion, pleased. Snape said only that the boy had begun, and that beginning was the smaller half of the work, and that he would have to practice this every night of his life until the closing of the door was as easy and as unthought of as the drawing of a breath. But Harry heard, underneath the severity, the thing that the severity was made to hide, and he went to bed that night warmer than the small fire could account for. Neither of them spoke of why. Harry was still too young to be told, and Snape was not a man to burden a child with a war that had not yet come for him. But Snape knew what he was doing, and he did it with the grave care of a man planting a seed in ground he will not live to see flower. He was building, in the mind of the boy he had never meant to love, a wall against a darkness that was only sleeping. He was giving Harry, years early, the one defense that might one day stand between him and the mind that would hunt him through his dreams. And he was doing it in the only language he had ever trusted, the language of discipline and of quiet, laying down the stones of that wall one patient night at a time, and asking nothing and saying nothing, and loving the boy the only way a guarded man knows how. Up next in Chapter 10, A Letter That Changed Everything, will follow the arrival of a certain envelope at Spinner's End, and the strange threshold of a childhood ending as Harry turns 11 and the castle at last comes calling. Chapter 10, A Letter That Changed Everything. Every childhood has a last quiet morning, though no child knows it while it is happening. Harry's came in the summer he turned 11, on a warm and ordinary day at Spinner's End, when the light lay yellow across the worn floorboards, and the row of houses beyond the window drowsed in the heat of the mill town. Nothing about that morning announced itself. The kettle sang as it always sang. The high shelves held their bottles and their books as they had always held them. And Severus Snape stood at the narrow kitchen window with his back to the room, looking out at the gray street, waiting for a thing he had known for 11 years would come, and dreading it more than he had let himself admit. The letter came, as such letters always come, without a postman. Harry heard the soft, heavy sound of it before he saw it, the sound of thick paper settling against wood, and he turned to find an envelope lying on the kitchen table, where a moment before there had been nothing. It was heavy and yellowish, the color of old cream, and it was addressed in green ink in a hand he did not know. He read his own name upon it, and beneath his name he read the words that told him the house and the town, and even the small back bedroom in which he had slept every night of his remembered life. Somebody, somewhere, knew exactly where he was. Somebody had always known. He looked up at his guardian, and Snape had turned from the window, and the two of them stood for a moment in the sunlit kitchen with the letter on the table between them, like a stone dropped into still water. Harry had grown up in a house that was full of magic, and yet strangely silent about it. He had seen Snape stir a cauldron with a look, had watched dishes wash themselves and doors unlatch at a glance, had lived inside wonders so daily that he had never thought to question them. But no one had ever spoken to him plainly about what he was, or what he might become, or the world that waited somewhere past the gray edges of the mill town. That silence had not been cruelty. Harry understood, even at 11, that it had been a kind of protection, the way a person shades a young flame with a cupped hand. Snape told him then, in the slow, careful way he told the boy everything that mattered, the truth of the letter. It came from a school. It was called Hogwarts, and it was very old and very hidden, a castle far to the north. And children like Harry went there when they turned 11 to learn the shaping of the magic that was already awake in them. Harry listened, and the strangest part was not the news itself. For some part of him had always half known it, the way a person half knows the ending of a story they have heard many times. The strangest part was the look on his guardian's face while he spoke. Snape was telling him that he would go away, and there was in the telling a grief so carefully hidden that only a boy who had spent his whole life reading this man's hidden things could have found it at all. For Harry understood something in that kitchen that he had never quite let himself understand before. He understood that the going would be a leaving, that the narrow house of books and bottled potions, the spare room, the fire, the two chairs turned toward one another in the evenings, all of it would be behind him. And more than that, he understood that his guardian felt the coming of that leaving as a wound, though the tall man would sooner have walked into cold water than say so. Harry had lived 11 years, learning the shape of Snape's silences, And this silence had a shape he had never met before, and it frightened him a little, because it meant that even this hard and certain man could be made afraid by a single sheet of paper. There was another strangeness in it, one that Snape did not speak of that morning, but that would soon become the whole weather of Harry's new life. The school to which the boy was going was the very school in which his guardian taught. Snape was a master at Hogwarts, the keeper of its dungeons and its cauldrons, feared by nearly every child who passed under his shadow. And Harry would arrive there, not as a stranger, but as the ward of that feared man. He would walk into a great hall full of children who had grown up on stories of the terrible professor of the dungeons. And he would be, to all of them, the boy that terrible man had raised. It was a strange threshold to stand upon, and Snape, looking at him across the sunlit table, seemed to see the whole difficult road of it stretching out ahead of the child, and to grieve that he could not walk it for him. The days that followed were full of small preparations, and there was a tenderness in them that neither of them named. Snape took the boy to buy the things the letter asked for, and Harry saw for the first time the hidden world he had only ever glimpsed. The crooked street of shops, the owls and the cauldrons and the shelves of wands, the great white building where the money of that world was kept. He was fitted for robes that felt strange and heavy on his young shoulders. He chose, or was chosen by, a wand of his own, and the moment it settled into his hand, something in him woke that had been sleeping all his life. And he understood, at last, all in a rush, that he truly was what the letter said he was. Through all of it, his guardian walked a pace behind him, watchful, saying little, letting the boy meet his own new life with his own two hands, and yet never once out of reach. On the last night at Spinner's End, before the great train would carry him north, Harry could not sleep. He lay in the spare room that had been his since before memory, and he practiced the closing of his mind the way Snape had taught him. And for once it would not close, because his mind was too full of the morning to come. He thought of the castle he had never seen. He thought of the children who would look at him and see only the shadow of the man who had raised him. And he thought, most of all, of that man, sitting even now downstairs by the low fire with his book unread in his lap. A man who had taken in the crying child of a woman he had loved and lost, and had raised him in silence and severity and secret devotion for 11 long years, and who would tomorrow watch him board a train and go. Harry did not yet know the whole of why he mattered so much to the hard man downstairs. He did not know the story that lay behind his mother's green eyes, or the vow made over a ruined cottage on a cold night before he could remember. But he knew, lying in the dark on the last night of his childhood, that he was loved, not spoken of, not shown in the easy way other children were shown, but loved in the deep and difficult manner of the house he had grown up in, and he carried that knowledge with him into sleep like a small warm coal, and in the morning he rose to meet the letter that had changed everything. Up next, in Chapter 11, the ward of the Dungeon Master will walk with Harry into the castle at last, watched and suspected and misunderstood by everyone, and bound to a stern professor by a tie that no one else can read. Chapter 11, the ward of the Dungeon Master. The castle rose out of the dark like a thing dreamed rather than built, its many windows lit with warm gold against the black water and the black hills. And Harry, standing small among the other first-year children at the edge of the great lake, felt the whole weight of his new life settle onto his shoulders at once. He had grown up in a narrow house in a gray town, in rooms he could cross in a few steps, and now here was Hogwarts, vast and ancient and full of turning stairs and whispering portraits, and somewhere inside it, down in the cold heart of its dungeons, was the only person in all that great stone world who knew his name the way a person truly knows a name. He was sorted that first night, as all children are sorted, and the old hat that read the shapes of young minds sat a long while upon his head, longer than it sat on most, for there was more written in Harry than 11 years should have held. When at last it named his house, he went to his table among children who did not yet know him, and he ate his first supper in the great hall under the floating candles, and all the while he was aware, the way one is aware of a fire in a cold room, of a tall, dark figure seated far away at the high table of the teachers. He did not look at that figure often, and the figure did not look at him at all, and to every eye in the hall the two of them were strangers. Only they knew otherwise, for this was the strange country into which Harry had come. He was the ward of the dungeon master, of Severus Snape, the potions professor whom every child at Hogwarts feared, and there was no way to hide it and no way to explain it. The story went round the school within days, as such stories do, passing from the older students to the younger in the corridors and the common rooms. The boy that Snape had raised, the child that the terrible man of the dungeons had taken in. Some of the children looked at Harry with a kind of horrified pity, as though he had grown up inside a locked cellar. Some looked at him with suspicion, as though a boy raised by so cold a man must surely carry some of that cold himself. And nearly all of them, whatever else they felt, kept a careful distance, so that Harry moved through those first weeks inside a small circle of empty air that followed him wherever he went. It was a lonely thing, and Harry felt the loneliness of it keenly, but he did not let it bend him. He had been raised, after all, by a man who had taught him the worth of silence and the strength that lives in a steady patience, and Harry drew on both. He did his work well and quietly. He watched more than he spoke. And slowly, one at a time, a few of the other children looked past the shadow that hung over him and found the thoughtful, watchful boy beneath it. And to those few, Harry gave a loyalty as deep and as unshowy as everything else about him. But friendship came to him harder than it came to most, and the reason for that was always the same. He was the dungeon master's boy, and in a school that feared the dungeon master, that mark was not easily rubbed away. The professors, too, did not know quite what to make of him. Some of them, kind and gray and gentle, went out of their way to be warm to the child, as though to make up for the coldness they imagined he had suffered. Others watched him with a quiet unease, unsure whether the ward of so severe a man could be wholly trusted, half expecting him to be sly, or sullen, or secretly cruel. Harry felt all of it. He had grown up learning to read the smallest turnings of a hard man's face, and so he read these faces easily, and he understood that he was, to nearly everyone in the castle, a thing to be wondered at and worried over, rather than a boy to be simply known. And Snape himself gave him nothing. This was the cruelest strangeness of all, and it was a cruelty of love, though Harry needed time to understand it as such. In the great hall, in the corridors, in the cold dungeon classroom, where Harry learned potions among children who trembled at the professor's step, Snape treated his ward with a coldness so complete that it might have been carved from the castle stone. He did not soften for the boy. He did not favor him. If anything, he was harder on Harry than on any other child, sharper with his corrections, colder with his silences, so that the other students, watching, could not have guessed in 100 years that the two of them shared a hearth and a history and a home in a gray town far to the south. It wounded Harry at first, this coldness worn in public like a mask. He was still young, and some part of him had hoped, foolishly and against all he knew of the man, that the castle might soften him, that here among so many watching eyes his guardian might at last let a little of the hidden warmth show. But it did not, and could not, and in time Harry came to understand the reason. Snape was a spy in the deepest chamber of his own life. A man who had walked a knife's edge for years and would walk it again, and the safety of the boy he loved depended on no one at all, ever guessing how much he loved him. To show tenderness would be to hang a lantern over the one thing in the world that could be used against him. And so Snape hid it, and hid it, and hid it, and the hiding was itself the deepest love the boy had ever been given. For there were signs, if a person knew where to look, and Harry knew. He noticed that on the coldest nights a warming charm lay always upon his corner of the dormitory, though no other bed was so blessed, and no one ever said a word. He noticed that when danger brushed near him, a stumble on a high stair, a jostle from an older and crueler boy, some quiet correction always seemed to fall upon the trouble before it could grow. And the dungeon master was always, somehow, not far off. He noticed that on the evenings when his loneliness pressed hardest, a task or an errand would come to him from the potions master that kept him late and safe and out of the reach of the long, empty castle nights. None of it was ever spoken. All of it was there. So Harry lived that first year in the castle as a boy inside a puzzle that only he and one other person held the key to. To the school, he was the dungeon master's ward, watched and suspected and misunderstood, moving alone through the great stone corridors under a shadow he had not chosen. But underneath the shadow ran a tie invisible to every other eye, a bond made of warming charms unspoken, and dangers quietly turned aside, and a coldness worn in public precisely because the love beneath it was too great to risk. Harry carried that secret through the turning of the seasons, and it warmed him more than the castle fires, and it taught him, young, the hardest and truest lesson of his guardian's whole hard life, that the deepest care is often the most carefully hidden, and that a silence can hold more love than 1,000 spoken words. Up next in Chapter 12, Old Enemies, Old Loyalties, we'll meet the men who loved Harry's mother and father before he was born, and the ancient hatreds they carry, and the boy caught tenderly between them. Chapter 12. Old Enemies, Old Loyalties. Every person carries a past that is older than the people who come to love them, and Harry was about to learn that his own past reached back further than his memory, into the years before he was born, into the corridors of the very castle in which he now lived. For the world into which he had come was not a new world at all. It was an old one, worn deep with old friendships and older grudges, and threaded all through it were the lives of men who had known his mother and his father when they too were young and quick and full of laughter in these same stone halls. The first of these men to come near him was Remus Lupin, a gentle and graying figure with kind and tired eyes. A man who wore his weariness the way some men wear an old coat, without complaint and without hiding it. Lupin had been a friend of Harry's father in the far-off days of their own school years, one of a close and reckless band of boys who had roamed the castle together and called themselves by names that Harry did not yet understand. When Lupin looked at Harry, he seemed to see two people at once, the boy who stood before him and the friend he had lost long ago, for Harry had something of his father in the set of his shoulders and the way he held his head, and it plainly moved the tired man to see it. Lupin was kind to Harry with a kindness that had grief folded quietly inside it, and Harry, who had grown up reading the hidden weather of a difficult man, felt the grief beneath the kindness and was gentle with it. But it was the other man, the one who came later and came like a storm, who taught Harry how deep and how tangled the old loyalties of that lost band of boys truly ran. His name was Sirius Black, and he had been the dearest friend of Harry's father, closer than a brother. A bright and reckless and devoted man who had loved James Potter with his whole heart. And Sirius, when at last he came into Harry's life, looked upon the boy with a love so fierce and so sudden that it nearly frightened the child. For here was a man who had lost everything he loved in a single night, and who saw in Harry the last living piece of it. Sirius wanted to gather the boy up and pour into him all the fatherly love that had been dammed and darkened by the long gray years of his grief. There was only one trouble, and the trouble was as old as the men themselves, and as bitter as anything Harry had ever tasted. Sirius Black and Remus Lupin, the last of that reckless band of boys, hated Severus Snape. They had hated him when they were all children together in this castle, with the thoughtless cruelty of clever boys who have chosen a target, and Harry would come in time to learn how much that old cruelty had cost the lonely gifted boy that Snape had once been. And Snape hated them in return, an equal and answering hatred, cold where theirs was hot, patient where theirs was reckless, but no less deep for that. The wound between them was more than 30 years old, and it had never healed, and it never would. And now it lay across the middle of Harry's life like a river he could not help but stand in. For here was the shape of it. The men who had loved Harry's father and mother were the very men who most despised the man who had raised him. And the man who had raised him, who had given him 11 years of quiet devotion and warming charms and patient lessons before the fire, could not so much as hear the names of those two men without his long face going still and hard as the castle stone. Harry loved his guardian. That love was the foundation of his whole life, the thing he had been built upon. But he was hungry, too, for these men who could tell him of the parents he had never known, who carried in their memories the laughter of his mother and the voice of his father. Treasures that Snape gave him only in guarded and rationed pieces. And so the boy found himself caught, tenderly and painfully, between the loyalties of the dead and the loyalties of the living. Sirius could not understand it. To Sirius it was a wound past all bearing that the son of James Potter should have been raised by Severus Snape, of all the men in the world, by the cold and bitter master of the dungeons. And he could not keep the horror of it from his face when he spoke of it. He wanted to save Harry from that upbringing, as one saves a child from a cold house, not seeing, because his old hatred blinded him to it, that the cold house had in truth been full of a hidden warmth, and that the boy had been loved there more truly than Sirius, in his grief and his fury, could have guessed. And Harry, hearing his guardian spoken of so, felt something rise in him that surprised even himself, a fierce and protective loyalty to the hard man who had raised him, so that he found himself defending Snape to the very people who most wished to love him. And Snape, for his part, could not bear the thought of the boy near those two men. Some of it was the old hatred, plain and undying, but some of it, and this Harry would understand only much later, was fear. Snape had kept the boy safe for 11 years by holding him close and holding the world at a careful distance. And now here came men who could pull the child away from him, men who had claim of a kind that Snape could never speak aloud. For the vow he had made had been a secret vow, made over a ruined cottage in the dark, and he could not stand before Sirius Black and Remus Lupin and tell them why the boy was his to guard. So he did what he had always done. He went colder. He said less. And he watched the men who loved James Potter draw near to the child he loved, and he could do nothing but stand and bear it in silence. Harry, in the middle of all of it, did a thing that was wiser than his years, though he did not think of it as wisdom. He refused to choose. He would not let Sirius turn him against his guardian, and he would not let his guardian's coldness close his heart against the men who had loved his parents. He held them all, the living and the memory of the dead, in the same steady and open hands, and he loved each of them for what each of them was, and he grieved, quietly, that they could not love one another. He was too young to mend the wound between them. It was older than he was, and deeper than any child could reach. But he could refuse to let it break him, and he could carry, in his own person, a peace that the men around him had lost long ago. A peace that came from having been raised, whatever else, by a man who had taught him that hatred is a heavy thing to carry, and that a steady heart is worth more than a sharp one. And so the boy walked on through the old country of his parents' past, learning the shapes of its ancient hatreds and its faithful loves, caught tenderly between the men of the living present and the ghosts of the vanished years, and holding them all with a gentleness that none of them had thought to teach him, and that all of them, in their different and wounded ways, had somehow given him without knowing. Up next in Chapter 13, The Stone and the Stammering Man, we'll follow Harry into the first true danger of his years at the castle, a hidden treasure and a nervous professor, and a hidden protection that this time the boy will see and understand at last. Chapter 13. The Stone and the Stammering Man. The first year at Hogwarts moved slowly, the way a long river moves, wide and quiet and deeper than it looks. For Harry, the castle had settled at last into something like a home, though it was a stranger home than the narrow house at Spinner's End, with its 1,000 staircases that liked to change their minds and its suits of armor that hummed old carols out of season. He had learned the way to the Great Hall, and the way to the library, and the long way down to the dungeons, where a certain door was always shut and a certain man was always waiting, and where, more nights than anyone would ever guess, he was fed and warmed and watched over by the person the rest of the school feared most. There was a thing hidden in the castle that year, though few of the students knew it. It lay behind a locked door on the 3rd-floor corridor, guarded by a great 3-headed dog whose snoring shook the dust from the torches. Beyond that dog, down through trapdoor and trial, lay the Philosopher's Stone, a small red thing that could turn any metal to gold and brew a draught to keep a person living forever. It had been brought to Hogwarts for safekeeping by Albus Dumbledore and by his old friend Nicholas Flamel, and it was wanted, badly and secretly, by something that had no body of its own and no right to walk the earth. Harry did not understand all of this at first. He understood only that the year had a strange tension threaded through it, the way a house feels different when someone in it is ill. He noticed that Severus limped for a time after Halloween, and that he would not explain the wound. He noticed that the man who had raised him watched the new defense teacher, Professor Quirrell, with a fixed and quiet suspicion, the way a cat watches a corner where it has heard a mouse. Quirrell was a small, trembling man who wore a great purple turban and stammered so badly that his sentences seemed to fall down before they could stand. Most of the school pitied him or laughed at him. Severus did neither. Severus, Harry saw, was afraid of him, and Severus was not a man who was often afraid. There came a night, cold and clear, when Harry could not sleep, and the sense of wrongness in the castle had grown too loud to ignore. He had pieced together, the way clever and lonely children do, more than the grown-ups meant him to know. He had guessed that the stone was in danger, and he had guessed wrongly, in the way that everyone guessed wrongly that year, that the danger wore black robes and had a hooked nose and lived in the dungeons. It was an easy thing to believe, for Severus was severe and secretive, and the whole world had taught Harry that severe and secretive men were the ones to fear. And yet, some quieter part of him did not believe it at all, for he had lived under that hard roof for 10 long years, and he knew the difference between a man who guards a secret and a man who guards a child. So Harry went down, past the sleeping dog, through the strangling plant and the room of winged keys, across the great stone chessboard, and down toward the last chamber. He did not go entirely alone, for two friends went with him, brave and frightened both. But in the end, the last door was his to pass alone. And there, in a bare round room lit by nothing but a mirror, he found not the man he had feared, but the man he had pitied. Quirrell stood before the mirror of Arist, with his turban unwound, and behind his own face, pressed into the back of his skull like a mask worn on the wrong side, was a second face, white and thin and terrible, with red eyes and slits for a nose. It was the face of the thing that had murdered Lily. It was the shadow of Voldemort, kept half alive by unicorn blood and by the will of a servant who had opened his own body to it. What happened next, Harry would carry for the rest of his life. The wraith commanded the servant to seize him, and the servant obeyed, and where Quirrell's fingers touched Harry's skin they blistered and cracked and burned to ash, as though the boy were made of something the darkness could not hold. Harry did not understand the reason then. He only knew that, when he pressed his hands to that ruined face, the pain that flooded his own scar was matched by a greater agony in his enemy, and that he held on, half blind and screaming inside, until the world went white and he fell. The reason was old, and it was simple, and it had been written into him on a night in Godric's Hollow before he could remember. His mother had died to save him, and her love had left a protection in his very skin, a thing older and deeper than any wand spell, so that the servant of the one who had killed her could not touch him and live. Lily had reached forward across 10 years and shielded her son again, and Harry was too young to know it, and the man who had loved her sat in a corridor far above, not knowing whether the boy still breathed. For Severus had known, that night, that something was wrong. He had followed as far as the trapdoor, and had been held back by the enchantments and by his own place in the plan that Dumbledore had woven, and he had waited in a torment that no cold face could hide, until word came that the headmaster had gone down after the boy and brought him back alive. And when Harry woke, days later, in the soft white light of the hospital wing, with a pile of sweets at his bedside sent by half the school, the first thing he saw was not Dumbledore and not his friends. It was Severus, seated stiff and sleepless in a hard chair by the window, pretending to read, having sat there through every night of the boy's fever and meaning never to admit it. They did not speak of love, for they never did, but Harry understood, at last and all at once, the thing that the rest of the castle would never be allowed to see. The limp after Halloween had come from the three-headed dog, for Severus had gone to check the stone's defenses himself. The muttering under his breath at the Quidditch match, the muttering that the whole school had taken for a curse, had been a counter-curse, a protection spoken to keep Harry safe upon his broom, while another man tried to throw him from the sky. Every suspicion the world had aimed at the man who raised him had been aimed at the wrong target, and the man had let it be, because being hated was a small price and the boy was worth it. Harry looked at the stern, tired face by the window, and he did not need to be told any of it. He simply reached out and let his hand rest for a moment on the sleeve of that black robe, and Severus, without looking up from his unread book, did not pull away. Outside, the last snow of the year was melting from the towers, and the stone had been destroyed so that no one could ever misuse it, and the shadow of Voldemort had fled once more into the forests of the east. Weaker than before, but not gone. And for one quiet hour in a bright white room, a guardian and his ward sat together and were, without a single word, understood. Up next in Chapter 14, The Chamber and the Serpent, We will follow Harry into a second year, darkened by whispers and stone-still figures, and watch a hard man's terror grow behind a cold and careful face. Chapter 14. The Chamber and the Serpent. The second year began under a sky the color of old iron, and it carried a shadow with it from the very first night. Harry came back to Hogwarts changed a little by the summer, taller, quieter, and more certain than he had been of the strange bond that tied him to the man in the dungeons. He had spent his holiday at Spinner's End, as he always did, among the bottled potions and the leaning shelves of books, and Severus had spent it as he always did, feeding the boy and correcting his grammar and pretending that the small, careful mercies were nothing at all. But the castle they returned to would not stay peaceful for long, for something ancient had woken beneath it. It began with words written on a wall in a wet red that would not wash away. Words warning that a hidden chamber had been opened and that the enemies of a certain bloodline should beware. Beneath the message hung the caretaker's cat, stiff as carved stone, its eyes wide and staring, and its whiskers frozen in the torchlight. It was not dead, though it looked so. It had been petrified, turned to living stone by something none of the students had seen, and as the weeks passed, it was not the only one. A boy was found, then another, then a ghost and a girl, each of them frozen mid-breath, each of them struck by a horror that left no wound. The whole school fell into a slow and creeping fear. Doors were locked earlier, corridors emptied faster, and the talk in the great hall dropped to whispers whenever a shadow crossed the door. There was an old story behind it all, a legend of the Chamber of Secrets, a hidden room built 1,000 years before by one of the founders of the school, a man who had wished to drive out those he thought unworthy of magic. Within the chamber, the legend said, lived a monster that only the founder's true heir could command. And now, it seemed, the heir had come again, and the monster was loose. Harry felt the fear more keenly than most, and for a reason he could not explain to anyone, not even to Severus at first. He had begun to hear a voice, cold and hungry, sliding through the walls where no one else could hear it, a voice that spoke of ripping and tearing and killing, a voice that moved through the pipes of the ancient castle like water. It frightened him badly, for a boy who hears voices in the walls begins to wonder whether the trouble lies in the walls or in himself. He carried the secret for a long while before he brought it, one gray evening, down the long stair to the dungeons. And there the thing that had raised him showed itself again, not in soft words, for there were never soft words, but in the way the man went very still and very white, and in the way he made the boy repeat exactly what the voice had said, and in the way he did not laugh or scold or turn away. Severus, alone among the teachers, understood at once what the voice must be, for he had studied the dark and knew its languages. He knew that only one kind of creature could speak so, and he knew what walked and killed in the deep places of the world. And behind his careful, closed expression, Harry saw, for a moment, something that looked very much like dread. For Severus was afraid, and the fear was not for himself. He had spent 11 years keeping one small candle burning in a cold house, guarding it from wind and from ill fortune, and from his own bad temper. And now, the castle he had trusted to shelter that candle had turned into a place where children were being turned to stone by a thing no one could see. Every morning that the boy came whole to breakfast was a morning the man had not dared to count upon. Every night, Severus walked the corridors long after the others slept, a black shape moving through the dark, checking the shadows the boy might pass through, undoing quietly the small dangers no one else had noticed. He never said that he did this. He would have denied it coldly if asked. But Harry, who had learned to read the silences of a hard man as easily as other children read faces, knew. The winter deepened, and the mystery tightened like a cord. Suspicion fell first upon one student, then another, then upon Harry himself, for it was discovered that he could speak the serpent tongue, the language of snakes, a rare and shadowed gift that the founder of the chamber had also possessed. The school drew away from him then, frightened, and even those who should have known better looked at him sideways in the halls. It was a lonely time, and it might have broken a lesser-kept child. But Harry had been raised by a man the whole world misjudged, a man who had worn the school's hatred for years without complaint, and so Harry knew, better than any of them, that being feared was not the same as being guilty, and that a person could carry a dark reputation and a faithful heart in the very same breast. He learned, before the end, where the danger truly lay. A memory hidden in the pages of an old diary, a memory of a clever, handsome boy who had lived at the school 50 years before, had reached out of the past to work its will in the present. The boy in the diary was the young Voldemort himself, the child the Dark Lord had once been, before he cast away his name and his humanity. And it was his preserved shadow that had opened the chamber again and set the great serpent loose to hunt. A girl had been taken down into the deep at last, carried into the chamber to die so that the memory might grow strong enough to return, and the school stood on the very edge of closing its doors forever. What happened in the chamber below is a tale for braver hours than this, and Harry lived it and survived it, though he came near enough to death to feel its breath. He faced the serpent and the shadow of the Dark Lord alone in a drowned stone hall, and he was helped, at the last, by loyalty and by courage and by a small miracle of feather and flame. And he came up out of the dark, carrying the rescued girl and the ruined diary, pale and bloodied and alive. And when he reached the surface, worn to nothing and swaying on his feet, the first figure to come through the far door, robes flying, face bloodless, all pretense of coldness burned away for the length of a single breath, was Severus, who had come down as far as the law and the plan would let him, and who had waited above in an agony he would never name. He mastered his face again in an instant, as he always did, and by the time he reached the boy he was stern and dry and complaining that Harry was late for supper and dripping filth on the floor. But Harry saw the truth in the half-second before the mask came down, and it warmed him more than any fire. That night, back in the quiet of the dungeon rooms, the man cleaned and bound the boy's wounds with hands that were not quite steady, and said nothing kind and meant everything. The school reopened its doors. The petrified woke to find the world unchanged, and the shadow of Voldemort withdrew once more, foiled but far from finished, gathering itself in the dark of far countries. Up next in Chapter 15, The Prisoner and the Truth of the Rat, we will meet an escaped man the whole world calls a murderer, and follow the unraveling of an old betrayal that will test a guardian's rage and a boy's unexpected mercy. Chapter 15. The Prisoner and the Truth of the Rat. The third year came in on a wind that carried fear before it, for a man had escaped from the fortress of Azkaban, and no one in living memory had ever done such a thing. His name was Sirius Black, and the world had spent 12 years believing that he was a murderer and a traitor. A man who had betrayed his dearest friends to the Dark Lord and laughed as he did it. The newspapers printed his hollow, screaming face on every corner, and the wireless spoke his name in low and frightened tones, and everyone agreed on one dreadful thing. Sirius Black had broken out of the inescapable prison for a single purpose, and that purpose was to find and to kill Harry Potter. Because the guards of Azkaban had joined the hunt, a cold came over the school that autumn that was worse than any winter. The Dementors, tall, hooded things that drink joy the way a sponge drinks water, were stationed at the gates of Hogwarts to keep the prisoner out, and wherever they drifted the light seemed to thin, and the air to freeze, and every happy thought to curl up and die. Harry felt them worse than anyone. When they came near, he heard again, from somewhere deep beneath memory, a woman's voice pleading. A voice he could not place and could not bear, and he would fall as though the ground had opened. It was the last cry of his mother, echoing up out of the night at Godric's Hollow, and the creatures dragged it to the surface and made him drown in it. Severus watched all of this with a face like a shut door, and beneath the door there was a storm. The name of Sirius Black meant more to him than to any teacher in the castle, for the two of them had been enemies since they were boys, and Black had once, long ago, played a cruel trick that had nearly cost Severus his life. That the man was now loose and hunting the child Severus had raised woke in him a rage that ran deep and old and cold as the fortress itself. He did not sleep much that year. He walked the borders of the grounds at night, wand ready, hunting the hunter, and he brewed a difficult potion month after month for the new defense teacher without complaint. And he watched the boy at every meal as though counting the seconds between one breath and the next. The new defense teacher was a shabby, gentle, tired man named Remus Lupin, and here the year folded a second secret into the first. Lupin had been a friend of Harry's parents, one of the four who had run wild through the castle in their school days, and he was also, though few knew it, a werewolf, cursed since childhood to turn beneath the full moon. It was for him that Severus brewed the steaming potion each month, the draught that let the wolf keep a human mind. There was no love lost between the two men, for the old school wounds had never healed, and yet Severus made the potion faithfully, month upon month, because a boy in the castle might be endangered by a wolf that ran mad, and because whatever else he was, Severus kept his word. Lupin, for his part, took a quiet care of Harry that the boy came slowly to treasure, and it was Lupin who taught him at last to fight the Dementors, to summon out of a happy memory a guardian of pure white light that could drive the cold things back. Harry practiced it in secret through the long dark evenings, reaching again and again for a thought strong enough to hold, and the thought that finally worked, the thought that blazed brightest of all, was not one he expected. It was the memory of a cold house made warm, of a stern man teaching him patience at a potions bench, of the 1 hour in a white hospital room when a hand had not pulled away. Out of that, and out of the mother he had never known, his light was born. The truth of Sirius Black, when it came all at once and turned the whole world over. On a wild night at the end of the year, in a tumble-down shack at the edge of the grounds, Harry learned that everything the newspapers had printed was a lie. Sirius Black had not betrayed his parents. Black had been Harry's father's dearest friend, and more, his own godfather, named to love and guard him if ever the worst should come. The true traitor was another of the four old friends, a small, gray, frightened man named Peter Pettigrew, who had sold Lily and James to the Dark Lord and then faked his own death and framed Black for the crime, and who had spent 12 years since hiding in the only shape that could keep him safe, the shape of a common garden rat, curled up warm and unsuspected in the castle itself. Into that shack, drawn by fury and by fear for his ward, came Severus, wand raised, certain that he had cornered a murderer and a wolf together, and meaning to see justice done that very night. And here the year set its hardest test, for the truth was tangled and the hatred was old, and Severus, in his anger, would not hear it. He looked at Sirius Black and saw only the boy who had once tried to kill him. He would have handed Black over to the sole drinking guards without a trial, and Black would have been given a fate worse than death, and the true traitor would have slipped away into the dark. It was rage, and it was not without cause, but it was rage all the same, and it was blind. What broke the moment was not a spell. It was Harry. The boy who had every reason to hate the man accused of hunting him stepped between the wands and asked, quietly, only that the truth be heard before it was too late. He had learned mercy from a strange teacher, from a hard man who had shown him, year upon year in unadmitted ways, that a fearsome face might hide a faithful heart. And so, Harry could not do to Sirius Black the thing the world had already done to Severus Snape. He would not condemn a man on a story. He made them wait, and he made them look, and in the looking the rat was forced back into a man, and the true traitor stood revealed and trembling before them all. Peter Pettigrew escaped that night, in the end slipping away in the confusion of the moon, and Sirius Black, still hunted by a world that would not yet believe him, fled into the wild to wait for a better day. It was not a clean victory. But something had shifted that Harry felt long after. Severus had come to that shack ready to let his oldest hatred rule him. And it was the child he had raised who had shown him a gentler way. And though the man would never say so, Harry believed a small stone had been rolled back from the door of his guardian's heart. On the last morning of the year, when Severus complained that Harry had once again nearly gotten himself killed, there was, under the coldness, something almost like pride. Up next in Chapter 16, A Tournament and a Guardian's Fear, we will watch a great and dangerous contest come to the castle and see an old dark mark begin to blacken upon a faithful man's arm as dread gathers at the edge of the world. Chapter 16. A Tournament and a Guardian's Fear. The fourth year came dressed in banners and bright with rumor, for Hogwarts had been chosen to host a great and ancient contest that had not been held in more than 100 years. It was called the Tree Wizard Tournament, a trial of magical skill between 3 great schools. And in the autumn, 2 carriages and 1 strange ship arrived at the castle carrying students from far countries, so that the great hall was suddenly full of unfamiliar voices and new faces and a holiday feeling that Harry had never known the castle to hold. For a little while it seemed that the year might be a bright one, a year of games and feasting, and Harry, who had grown tall and steady under his stern roof, let himself hope for peace. There was no peace to be had. The rules of the tournament held that only students of 17 or older might enter their names for the honor and the danger. For the 3 tasks set before the champions were deadly things, meant to test courage against fire and water and the deep unknown. Harry was 14 and had no wish to enter. And yet, on the night the champions were chosen, when the enchanted goblet had already spat out 3 names to a hall full of cheering, it flared a 4th time against all reason and threw out a scrap of parchment that bore the name of Harry Potter. A cold silence fell over the feast. Harry had not put his name in the cup. Someone else had. Someone who wished him harm, and by a binding older than the school he was now forced to compete. A boy among grown wizards, in a contest that had killed before. No one in that hall felt the shock of it more deeply than the man in black at the staff table. Severus had spent 13 years keeping the boy alive against a shadow that would not stay dead, and now he watched a trap close around his ward, in front of the whole school, laid by a hand he could not see. He said nothing. His face gave nothing. But that night, in the quiet of the dungeons, Harry saw the man pacing before the cold fireplace long past midnight, turning something over in his mind, and he understood that his guardian had read in the false entry the very thing Harry feared to name aloud. The goblet had not made a mistake. Someone had reached into the castle to put the boy in harm's way, and behind that someone, far off and patient, waited the shadow that had waited all along. The tasks came one by one, and each was more perilous than the last. In the first, Harry faced a dragon, a vast horned creature with a temper like a furnace, and won past it by nerve and by the flying skill he had loved since he was small. In the second, he went down beneath the black water of the lake into a cold green world of merpeople and grasping weeds to bring back something that had been taken from him, and came up half frozen and gasping and alive. Through all of it, Severus watched from the stands, with his arms folded and his jaw set, and though he never cheered and never smiled, he was there for every task. At the front of the crowd, his eyes fixed on the boy and on nothing else. He had schooled himself over the years to hide his fear behind sourness and complaint, and the world took the sourness at its face and never guessed the fear beneath. But Harry knew, and the knowing steadied him more than any charm. Behind the bright pageant of the year, something darker was moving, and it was written on the body of the man who had raised him. Long ago, in the days of his own worst mistakes, Severus had taken the dark mark upon his arm, the brand that Voldemort burned into the flesh of his servants. And for 13 years, while the Dark Lord was no more than a wandering shadow, the mark had lain faint and gray and quiet, a scar of an old wound. But that year it began to change. It began to darken. Slowly, week by week, the pale mark on his forearm grew clearer and blacker, as though ink long dried were somehow flowing again. And Severus knew what it meant, for he had felt the like before. The one who had made the mark was gathering strength somewhere in the world. The shadow was becoming a body. The Dark Lord was coming back. He did not tell Harry the whole of it, not then, for he was a man who carried his heaviest burdens alone. But Harry saw the way his guardian took to pressing a hand to his left arm when he thought no one was watching, and the way sleep left him, and the way a new gravity settled over him like a stone. And there came a night when Harry, unable to bear the silence any longer, asked him plainly what was wrong, and Severus, for once, did not turn the question aside with coldness. He drew back his sleeve in the firelight and let the boy see the darkening mark, and in the seeing Harry understood at last the shape of the thing that was coming, and understood too that the man before him was bound to it in a way that would soon demand a terrible price. For if the Dark Lord returned, the mark would summon its servants to him, and Severus would have to answer that summons or die, and to answer it would mean walking back into the very heart of the darkness that had killed Lily, and doing it for the sake of the boy who bore her eyes. The third task waited at the end of the year, a maze grown up on the Quidditch field, a hedge of thorns and enchantments with a prize at its center, and as the day of it drew near, the dread that Severus carried spread until it touched everything. He gave Harry more of his time in those last weeks than he ever had, though he disguised it as extra lessons and stern corrections and complaints about the boy's carelessness. He drilled him again in the guarding of his own mind, the difficult old discipline he had begun teaching Harry when the boy was still small at Spinner's End. And now Harry understood why it had mattered so much, and why a strange man had spent so many patient hours planting a defense in a child before the child could know its use. Everything Severus had ever given him, the strictness, the safety, the cold care, the quiet lessons, had been a preparation for a storm that only the guardian could see on the horizon. On the last evening before the final task, the castle lay hushed and golden in the long summer light, and for a little while the two of them sat together in the dungeon rooms as they had sat 1,000 times, the man reading, the boy near, neither one speaking of the fear that filled the space between them. There was no dialogue that needed saying. Harry knew that whatever came out of the maze, whatever crawled back into the world from the shadow, the man in black would stand between him and it, as he had stood since the night at Godric's Hollow. And Severus knew that the years of guarding were about to be tested as they had never yet been tested, that the double life he had lived so long in secret was about to begin in earnest, and that the boy he had raised from grief and ash was about to step out of childhood forever. The mark burned darker on his arm. The light faded slowly from the high windows, and the storm that both of them had felt coming for a year drew in its breath and prepared, at last, to break. Up next in Chapter 17, The Return of the Dark in a Double Life, we will follow a faithful man back into the shadow he once served, and see a boy begin to understand the terrible truth of what his guardian truly is and truly risks. Chapter 17, The Return of the Dark and a Double Life. There are nights in which a house seems to hold its breath, and the house at Spinner's End was holding its breath now. The graveyard at Little Hangleton was far away, and yet its cold seemed to have traveled up the length of the country and settled in the narrow rooms of books and bottled potions, so that even the fire in the grate burned lower than it should. Harry had come home from the Triwizard Tournament changed, older behind the eyes, carrying in his chest the memory of a boy who had died and of a shape rising out of a steaming cauldron. And Severus Snape, who had raised him from an infant crying in the wreckage of Godric's Hollow, sat in his chair with his sleeve buttoned to the wrist and did not speak of the thing that had come back into the world. But Harry knew. He had grown up reading the silences of this man the way other children learn to read weather, and he knew that something in the marrow of the house had shifted. The mark on Snape's arm had been darkening all year, a slow bruise waking from a long sleep, and on the night the Dark Lord returned, it had burned black and living and complete. Harry had not seen it, not then. But he had seen the way his guardian went still at the supper table, the way a hand rose halfway to a forearm and then was mastered and lowered again, the way the long face closed like a shutter against a storm. In the days that followed, Snape came and went at strange hours. He would be there in the morning, brewing at the bench with his usual severe patience. And then he would be gone in the night without a word of explanation, returning near dawn gray and drawn, his robes carrying a smell of cold and of distant fear. Harry lay awake and listened for the front door and counted the hours and did not ask. He had learned very young that some questions were kindnesses withheld. What Harry did not yet fully understand, though he was beginning to, was the shape of the life his guardian now lived. Severus Snape had walked back into the circle of the Death Eaters. He had knelt in the dark and offered explanations for his absence, and he had been believed because he was the finest liar the wizarding world had ever raised, and because the greatest of his lies was told to the greatest of his masters. He was a spy. He belonged to Albus Dumbledore, wholly and without reservation, and he wore the face of a servant of the Dark Lord so perfectly that the wearing of it was a kind of slow poison. Every night he went out he might not come back. Every word he spoke in that other house was weighed against his life, and he carried, folded small and secret in the innermost place of himself, the knowledge that the boy he had raised was the very thing the Dark Lord most wanted to destroy. It is a strange and terrible thing to guard a child by pretending to hate the world that would love him. Snape had spent Harry's whole childhood teaching him control, patience, the closing of the mind, the mastery of the face. And now the lessons turned back upon the teacher, and Harry understood at last what they had been for. They had not been coldness, they had been armor, fitted to a boy long before the boy could know he would need it. The occlumency that Snape had taught him at the potions bench, in the quiet, warm evenings of his childhood, was the same discipline that Snape now used to keep his own mind sealed against a legilimens who could peel a lesser man open like a fruit. Guardian and ward had been given the same secret weapon, and only now, with the dark returned, did the gift reveal its full and frightening purpose. Dumbledore came to Spinner's End more than once that summer, and Harry, sent to his room like a much younger boy, sat on the stairs and listened to the low music of two voices he could not make out. He knew that plans were being made in which he was the center and yet had no seat. He knew that his guardian and the old headmaster shared burdens too heavy to be spoken aloud in front of him. And he knew, with a certainty that ached, that Severus Snape had agreed to something costly, because the man came out of those meetings looking as though he had aged a further year in an hour. Harry began to see, dimly, that the person who had raised him was not merely stern and not merely brave. He was something rarer and more painful. He was a man who had chosen to stand in the exact middle of two fires and to be burned by both, for reasons he would not name. There were small moments in that heavy time that Harry would keep forever. Once, returning near morning, Snape found the boy asleep in the armchair by the cold grate, a book fallen open across his knees, having plainly tried and failed to wait up. And Harry, half waking, felt a coat laid over him, tucked with a clumsiness that tried to seem accidental, and heard the man move away without a word. Neither of them ever mentioned it. But Harry understood that the coldness of Severus Snape had always been a costume worn over something that could not afford to be seen, and that the thing beneath it had watched over him every night of his life. The double life his guardian now led among the Death Eaters was only the newest and most dangerous version of a double life the man had lived for years. The life of one who loved fiercely and showed it only in secret. As the summer wore into autumn and Harry prepared to return to the castle, the danger drew closer and the pretense grew harder. At Hogwarts, Snape would have to be crueler than ever, colder in the corridors, sharper in the classroom, more openly disdainful of the boy everyone believed he merely tolerated as a duty. For the watching eyes of the enemy were everywhere now, and any warmth between them could be a thread pulled loose to unravel the whole desperate deception. Harry steeled himself for it. He told himself that he could bear the public scorn because he knew the private truth, and mostly he could. But it cost him, as it cost the man, and the two of them carried the cost separately and alone, each protecting the other by refusing to show the wound. And so a boy who had once been an infant crying in a ruined cottage stood at the threshold of a war, guarded still by the same silent, severe, unshakable devotion that had lifted him out of the wreckage. He did not yet know the whole story. He did not yet know the memory of a silver doe, or the shape of a love that had lasted longer than death, or the reason a man with a serpent burned into his arm had knelt in the ashes and vowed to keep a child safe. Those truths were still folded and hidden. But Harry had begun to understand the outline of them, the way one understands the shape of a mountain in the dark before the dawn shows its face. His guardian was a spy, walking a knife's edge for love of a woman long dead and of the child she had left behind. And Harry loved him, quietly and completely, and was afraid for him every single night. Up next in Chapter 18, The Half-Blood Prince Revealed, we'll follow Harry as he stumbles upon the boyhood of the man who raised him, and finds in an old and secret book the clever, wounded child who once lived in a gray mill town, and begins to see the whole of the person hidden behind the mask. Chapter 18, The Half-Blood Prince Revealed. Some doors open by accident, and the ones that change us most are often the ones we never meant to open at all. Harry had known Severus Snape as a guardian and a teacher and a shadow at the edge of his whole life. And yet, there was a country in that man he had never been allowed to enter. The country of his boyhood. It lay behind him always, unspoken, a gray and folded thing. and Harry had learned not to reach for it. But that year, in a battered second-hand potions book found half by chance and half by fate, Harry stepped across the border into that hidden country, and what he discovered there rearranged everything he thought he understood about the man who had raised him. The book was old and much handled, its margins crowded with a small, cramped, spidery hand that improved upon every printed instruction. Where the textbook said one thing, the scribbled corrections said better, and Harry, following them, found his potions turning out finer than they ever had before. In a corner of the inside cover, in ink faded almost to memory, someone had written a name that was not quite a name. He was, the words declared, the Half-Blood Prince. Harry pored over that book like a boy reading a letter from a friend he had not yet met. The hand in the margins was clever and impatient and quietly proud, and it was, above all, alive with a mind that would not accept a rule simply because a rule had been printed. Harry loved that book before he ever guessed whose it had been. It came to him slowly, and then, all at once. The Half-Blood, the Milltown, the cramped, brilliant hand that he had seen 1,000 times on the labels of bottles at Spinner's End, on the corrections in the margins of his own childhood exercises, on the small, careful notes left beside a plate of supper on the nights his guardian went out into the dark. The boy who had owned this book had grown into the man who had raised him. The Half-Blood Prince was Severus Snape, and the prince had once been a child. That single fact, so obvious once seen, struck Harry with the force of a revelation, because he had never truly imagined his guardian as a boy at all. The man had always seemed to Harry to have arrived in the world already grown, already stern, already carrying the weight of years. And now, page by page, a boy stepped out of the shadows to meet him. Harry began to piece the child together the way one pieces together a face glimpsed through a rain-streaked window. He had grown up in a town like the town where Harry himself had been raised, a place of gray terraces and a dead river and a chimney standing against the sky. For Spinner's End had been the man's home long before it became the boy's. Harry had walked those same streets, had known that same cold light on the same cobbles, and he understood now that his own childhood had been lived inside the geography of his guardians. The house of books and bottled potions had not been chosen at random. It had been the only home the man had, the house he had grown up in, the house he had brought a crying infant back to, because it was the one place in the world that was his. Harry felt the walls of Spinner's End differently after that, as though he had been living all along inside another person's history. The boy in the margins had been poor and gifted and hungry to prove that his mind could lift him above the meanness of his beginnings. He had invented spells and improved potions and signed himself a prince because the world had given him nothing else to be proud of, and he had reached for a name that made a kingdom out of a half-blood boy in a threadbare coat. Harry recognized the ache in that. He had grown up watching his guardian withhold his own brilliance from a world that scorned it, brew wonders in a dim kitchen and let no one see, correct the errors of the printed page and never take the credit. The pride and the woundedness were of a single cloth, and the man had worn that cloth all his life. Harry, who had been raised by the grown prince, now met the boy who had first stitched it, and grief for that lonely child rose in him unbidden. There were harder things in the book too, and Harry did not turn away from them. In among the clever notes were flashes of a temper that could turn cruel, spells scribbled in the same hand that were meant to hurt, the marks of a boy who had been hurt himself and had learned to answer hurt with hurt. Harry had always known his guardian could be cold and sharp and unfair. He had felt the edge of the man's severity often enough. But now he saw where the edge had been forged, in a boyhood of poverty and mockery and loneliness. And understanding did not excuse the sharpness, but it did explain it. And explanation is a kind of mercy. The man who had raised him was not a saint and had never pretended to be one. He was something more difficult and more human than a saint. He was a wounded person who had chosen again and again to protect a child rather than to pass his wounds along. For that was the thing that shone clearest of all when Harry set the boy of the book beside the man of the house. The lonely prince, the poor and clever child who had signed himself a king to keep from feeling like nothing, had grown up and had been handed the orphan son of the world he came from, and he had not turned him away. He had brought the infant back to the gray house of his own unhappy boyhood, and had raised him there, patiently, secretly, tenderly, teaching him the very craft that had once been the boy prince's only refuge. The potions bench that had been the warmest place in Harry's cold childhood had been the warmest place in his guardian's cold childhood too. The man had given the child the one good thing he had ever owned. Harry understood that now, and something in him that had always strained against the man's severity went quiet at last, and forgave what there was to forgive. He closed the book that night and sat a long while in the dark, and he thought of the small spidery hand and the mill town and the crying infant carried back to a house of ghosts. He thought of the mask his guardian wore in the corridors, the sneer, the cold, the careful cruelty that kept the enemy from guessing where his heart truly lay. And he saw the mask for what it was, a costume stitched in childhood and worn ever after over a face too easily hurt to be shown. The half-blood prince was not a stranger. He was the boy who had become the man who had become, against every expectation of the watching world, a father in all but name to the son of a woman he had loved. Harry did not yet know how deep that love ran, or what shape it had taken, or what it had cost. But he had met the child at last, and he would never again mistake the coldness for the whole of the man. Up next in Chapter 19, The Silver Doe and the Falling of the Dark, we'll uncover the truth of a love that outlasted death itself and follow the war to its turning, where sacrifice and protection are gently reimagined so that a lifelong devotion need not end in the dark. Chapter 19. The Silver Doe and the Falling of the Dark. There is a kind of love that does not end when the beloved is gone, that goes on quietly burning in a cold house for years and years, warming a child who never knows its true name. Harry had lived his whole life inside such a love without seeing its center, and in the last dark winter of the war, he came at last to the heart of it and understood the man who had raised him wholly, and was never afraid to be understood in return. This is the chapter of the Silver Doe, and of the truth it carried, and of a dark that fell but did not, this time, take everything with it as it went. The war had turned bitter and long. The Dark Lord had spread across the land like a frost, and Harry had gone from the safety of the castle into the danger of the open country. Hunted, hidden. Searching for the secret means to end the thing that would not die. He carried heavy knowledge now, some of it given to him by Dumbledore before the old man was lost, some of it pieced together in sleepless nights. And through all of it, at the edge of his awareness, he felt the presence of his guardian like a hand held out in the dark. Severus Snape was deeper in his double life than ever, wearing the face of the enemy so completely that half the world believed the mask was the man. Harry knew better. Harry had always known better. But even Harry did not yet know the whole of it, until a doe made of silver light walked out of a snowbound wood and stood before him, and gazed at him with eyes he felt he had seen before, and led him to what he needed. The doe was a Patronus, and a Patronus is shaped by the deepest love a witch, or wizard carries. Harry followed it through the frozen trees, with a wonder rising in him. For there was something about the creature that spoke to him without words, something familiar and grieving and kind. It led him to what he had long sought, and then it faded into the falling snow. And Harry stood alone, with a mystery that would not let him rest. Whose love had made that shape? Whose devotion had reached across the miles and the danger to guide him? The answer, when it came, undid him and remade him. The doe was the mate of a stag, and the stag had been his mother's patronus long ago, and the silver doe that guarded Harry through the dark had been cast, all these years, by Severus Snape. For the love that shaped it was love of Lily, unbroken and undimmed by death, and it had taken the form of her own soul's companion, and it had never once faltered in all the long years of the man's grief. That was the truth at the center of everything. The truth that made sense at last of a whole life. Severus Snape had loved Lily Evans when they were children in a mill town. Two clever poor children walking home together under a gray sky, and he had gone on loving her when she chose another, and when she was taken from the world entirely, he had gone on loving her still. It was for her that he had knelt in the ruins of Godric's Hollow over a crying infant and made his silent vow. It was for her that he had brought the child home to the house of his own unhappy boyhood and raised him there, patiently, secretly, sternly, tenderly, for 16 years. Every lesson at the potions bench, every guarded story of a mother the boy could not remember, every coat laid clumsily over a sleeping child, every night walked upon the knife's edge among enemies. All of it had been the outward shape of a single inward love that had never let go. Harry understood now that he had been raised, from the very first, inside a devotion that had outlasted death, and the understanding filled him with a grief and a gratitude too large for any words. And here the dark, which in another telling might have swallowed the man whole, was made to fall more gently. For the love that had guided Harry through the snow was a love determined to protect and not merely to mourn, and it had made its plans with the same patient cleverness that had once crowded the margins of an old potions book. Snape had spent the war not only spying, but shielding, turning aside blows that no one saw fall, planting safeguards no one knew to thank him for, arranging in the shadows for the boy he had raised to survive the thing that hunted him. When the final confrontation came, and the serpent's master reached for the life of his most faithful servant, believing that death would hand him a power he coveted, the man was not so unguarded as his enemy supposed. He had learned defense at the same bench where he had taught it. He had prepared, as he prepared everything, in secret and in advance, out of a love that intended to keep its promise and to go on keeping it. The dark fell that night, but it did not take the guardian down with it. The serpent's strike found armor where it expected flesh, and the man who had vowed to keep a child safe lived to see the vow fulfilled. Harry reached him in the aftermath, in the smoke and the silence when the Dark Lord's power was breaking at last, and found him wounded and gray and alive. And in that moment, the whole of the truth passed between them, without the need to be spoken. The way so much had always passed between them, in silence and in the reading of a face. Harry knew that he had been loved every day of his life by a man who had never once said the word. Loved for his own sake, and for the sake of the green eyes he had inherited from a mother whose patronus was a doe. And the man, looking up at the boy he had raised from the wreckage of a ruined cottage, saw in those eyes not only the woman he had loved and lost, but the child he had saved and kept, and knew that the two were no longer a wound set against each other, but a single mercy, the past living on healed in the present. The dark had fallen. The vow had held. Neither of them had been left alone in the ashes. Outside, the long night of the war was ending, and a gray dawn was climbing over a broken and living world. There would be grief to carry, for grief always outlives a war, and there would be the slow work of rebuilding what the dark had thrown down. But the guardian and his ward had come through together, and the love that had shaped a silver doe and guided a boy through the snow had not been asked, this time, to end in death in order to prove itself true. It had proven itself instead in 16 years of quiet devotion and in one dark winter of unfaltering protection, and now it was permitted, at last, to rest in the ordinary daylight of a life still to be lived. Harry helped the man he had always secretly called father to his feet, and the two of them stood together in the ruined hall as the dawn came up, and neither of them needed to say what they both had always known. Up next in Chapter 20, the man who kept his word will come at last to the far side of the war, where a hard love is finally named in the plain light of day, and a boy raised in the shadow of a stern and faithful guardian comes gently and completely to rest. Chapter 20. The Man Who Kept His Word. When a long war ends, it does not end all at once, the way a story ends on its final page. It ends slowly, in the small returning ordinariness of days. In the first morning that no one is hunted, in the first evening that a fire may be lit without fear of the light being seen. And so it was for Harry and for the man who had raised him. The dark had fallen, the vow had held, and now there stretched before them the strangest and gentlest country of all, the country of afterward, in which there was nothing left to survive, and only, at last, the life to be lived. This is the chapter of that quiet country, and of a hard love finally spoken in the plain light of day, and of a boy who came, after everything, to rest. They went back to Spinner's End when the worst was over, the two of them, to the narrow house of books and bottled potions in the grey mill town, where both their childhoods had been lived. The house was the same as it had always been, dim and close and lined with the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime of brewing, and yet it was changed, because the fear had gone out of it. Severus Snape moved through his rooms more slowly now, an older and quieter man. The mark on his arm faded at last to a dead gray scar that no longer burned. He set his kettles to boil, and tended his fires, and corrected the errors of the printed page in his small spidery hand. And Harry, no longer a child, and not quite yet done with being raised, sat with him in the warm lamplight, and learned the last and easiest lessons the man had to teach, which were the lessons of an ordinary peace. It was in that peace that the thing which had gone unsaid for 16 years was finally said. Not grandly, for grandness had never belonged to Severus Snape, but plainly, in the quiet of an evening, in the sparse and careful words of a man who had spent his whole life hiding his heart and had grown tired of the hiding. He told Harry, in his own guarded way, that he had loved the boy's mother, and that he had loved the boy, and that the two loves had never been separate, but had always been one thing, carried together through the dark. He did not weep, and he did not embellish, and he did not ask to be thanked or forgiven. He only laid the truth down between them at last, the way one sets down a burden one has carried so long that the shoulders have forgotten what it is to be free of it. And Harry, who had known it all along in the wordless language of the man's care, received it now in words, and felt the last small distance between them close. Harry thought often, in those settling days, of the whole shape of the life he had been given. He thought of the ruined cottage at Godric's Hollow, and the infant crying in the wreckage, and of the grieving man who had come and made a silent vow over him. He thought of the reluctant first year, the resentment and the duty at war, and the small, unadmitted mercies that had won out in the end. He thought of his mother's green eyes looking back at his guardian every day, a wound and a comfort worn together. He thought of the lessons before the letters ever came, the quiet of the potions bench, the warmest place in a cold house. He thought of a childhood under a stern roof that had been, all along and in secret, a childhood of devotion. He thought of the truth of his mother given to him in stories and long silences, of occlumency taught young, of the letter at 11 and the strangeness of arriving at a school as the ward of its most feared teacher. He thought of old enemies and old loyalties, of a stone and a stammering man, of a chamber and a serpent, of a prisoner and the truth of a rat, of a tournament and a guardian's fear. He thought of the return of the dark and the double life, of the boy prince of the mill town revealed at last in the margins of an old book, of the silver doe walking out of the snow. And through all of it, holding all of it together, he saw the one unchanging thing. He had been kept safe every day of his life by a man who kept his word. That was how Harry would always name him when he named him to himself. Not the coldest teacher in the castle, not the spy who wore the enemy's face, not the wounded boy who had signed himself a prince, though he was all of those things. He was the man who kept his word. He had made a promise over a crying child in the ashes of a ruined house, when there was no one to see him make it, and no one to hold him to it, and every reason in the world to walk away. And he had kept that promise for 16 years, and through a war. And he had kept it not with grand gestures, but with the patient daily labor of a love he would not name until the very end. There is no braver thing in all the world than that, and Harry knew it. And he carried the knowledge gently, the way one carries something precious through a quiet house so as not to wake the sleepers. The seasons turned over the gray mill town, and the river that had once seemed dead caught the light of ordinary evenings, and the two of them settled into the unremarkable rhythm of a life that no longer had to be defended. There were suppers laid on the scrubbed table, and long, comfortable silences by the fire, and the small, warm sounds of a house at peace, the click of a kettle, the turn of a page, the settling of coals. Harry grew fully into himself in that house, no longer an orphan and no longer a ward, but simply a young man who had been well loved. And the man who had raised him grew old in it slowly, and without fear, his hard face softened by nothing more than the passage of untroubled days. The past was not forgotten, for such a past is never forgotten, but it had been made gentle. Lily lived on in her son's green eyes, and the eyes were no longer a wound to the man who looked into them, but only a comfort now, the last comfort, the mother living on, healed in the child she had left behind. And so we come to the end of the long tale, and to the rest that waits at the end of it. A boy who began his life crying alone in the wreckage of everything he had lost was carried out of that wreckage by a man the world thought incapable of tenderness, and was raised in a narrow house of books and quiet lamplight, and was loved, wholly and faithfully, and without a single word of it spoken aloud until the danger had passed. He grew up guarded by a promise. He grew up safe inside a devotion that outlasted grief and outlasted war, and asked for nothing in return. And in the end, when the dark had fallen and the vow had held, and there was nothing left to fear, he came home to the warm lamplight and the settling coals and the slow breathing of a peaceful house, and there, at the far side of everything, he laid his burdens down and came to rest. May you too lay down whatever you have carried into this night. May you rest as safely as a child kept by a man who kept his word. Sleep now and be at peace. And so we come, softly, to the end of the story. Tonight we followed a grief at Godric's Hollow, and a bargain struck with Dumbledore, a narrow house at Spinner's End, and a reluctant guardian learning a duty he never wanted. We saw the eyes of Lily looking back from her son, lessons taught before any letter came, and a childhood under a stern and secretly devoted roof. We watched the truth about his mother given in stories and silences, a young boy taught to guard his mind, and a letter that changed everything. We followed the ward of the dungeon master through old enemies and old loyalties, through the stone and the stammering man, the chamber and the serpent, the prisoner and the truth of the rat, and a tournament shadowed by a guardian's fear. We saw the dark return and a double life begun, the half-blood prince revealed, the silver doe and the falling of the dark, and at the last, the man who kept his word. There is nothing left now that you must remember. Let each of those bright and difficult things sink away from you, down through still dark water, growing fainter and fainter until only calm remains. You are safe. You are whole. Nothing here is broken, and nothing asks anything of you. Let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve like mist over a quiet moor. Good night. If this story carried you toward rest, stay with us. There are many more long, gentle tales waiting for the nights to come.